He grabbed her by the collar in front of 30 people, laughed in her face and said, "Women like you don't belong here." Then he hit her, open hand, right across her face, hard enough that her head snapped sideways and blood touched her lip. The bar went completely silent. Every single person in that room held their breath, waiting for her to explode. But what Lieutenant Emily Carter did next was something none of them would ever forget for the rest of their lives. And neither will you. If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and follow this story all the way to the end, because I promise you where this goes will shock you. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The bar was called The Anchor, and it had been sitting 3 blocks outside Naval Base Coronado for almost 40 years. It was the kind of place that had seen everything. Sailors celebrating homecomings, officers toasting promotions, young service members sitting alone at corner tables, staring into their drinks and trying to figure out how to carry the weight of things they couldn't talk about with anyone who hadn't been there themselves. On this particular Friday night in late October, the place was packed. A group of 12 Army Rangers had pushed 3 tables together near the back and were already on their 4th round before 9 o'clock. They were loud in the way that men get loud when they've spent weeks in controlled, disciplined environments and have finally been given permission to breathe. They weren't bad men, most of them weren't anyway, but they were a group, and groups do things that individuals would never do alone. They feed each other, they amplify each other, and when there's someone at the center of a group whose ego has never once been challenged in a way that's stuck, that amplification can turn into something ugly very fast. Sergeant First Class Ryan Mitchell was sitting at the head of that pushed-together arrangement of tables, like a man who had decided somewhere along the way that the world owed him an audience. I was 34 years old, 6'2", the kind of build that announced itself before he even opened his mouth. He had ribbons on his chest and a deployment history that was genuinely impressive. 3 combat rotations, a commendation for valor, and the kind of reputation among his men that made younger Rangers want to prove themselves to him specifically. But reputation and character are not the same thing. And Ryan Mitchell, for all his professional accomplishments, had a fundamental problem that no training exercise had ever corrected. He could not stand being in a room where someone else was quietly impressive without needing to diminish it. He'd done it his whole career. The moment he sensed that something near him was operating at a level that threatened his position at the center of things, a switch flipped inside him. And when that switch flipped, the intelligence and discipline that made him effective in the field disappeared completely. What was left wasn't a soldier, it was something smaller, something insecure dressed up in authority. Emily Carter had been sitting at the far end of the bar for about an hour before Ryan even noticed she was there. She was wearing civilian clothes, dark jeans, a plain gray long sleeve, her hair pulled back. She had a glass of water with a slice of lemon, a pint of something amber she hadn't touched, and a paperback novel open on the bar in front of her. She wasn't trying to be invisible. She just didn't need to be seen. There's a difference, and most people never learn it. She was 28 years old, and she had just returned from a deployment that she could not legally discuss with anyone outside of a very short list of cleared personnel. She had been back on American soil for exactly 11 days. In those 11 days, she had slept more than she had in the previous 4 months, combined eaten food that didn't require a heating element or come in a vacuum-sealed pouch, and had her first real conversation with her younger sister, who was getting married in the spring and wanted to know if Emily could be a bridesmaid, even though bridesmaids had to commit to dress fittings, and Emily's schedule was, as her sister put it, basically classified. Emily had laughed at that, actually laughed, which told her that she was starting to decompress because for the first 3 days back, nothing had seemed funny. Nothing had seemed much of anything. That was normal, her team psychologist had told her. The nervous system needed time to understand that it was no longer in a place where every sound might mean something lethal. The transition back to ordinary life was its own kind of mission, and it required its own kind of patience. So she had come to the Anchor, not because she was lonely, not because she needed company, but because sitting in her apartment had started to feel like a different kind of isolation. And sometimes the background noise of a room full of living people was the most restful thing in the world. She was reading a novel about a woman climbing K2 alone. She was on page 247. She did not expect the night to go any other way than quietly. The first time Ryan Mitchell looked at her, he looked away. The second time he looked a little longer. The third time he leaned over to one of his rangers, a younger guy named Decker, who everyone called D, and who was genuinely decent when Ryan wasn't around to perform for, and said something that made Decker glance over at Emily and then look immediately back down at his drink. "Sarge, come on," Decker said, quietly. "The way you say something when you already know it won't matter." Ryan ignored him. He stood up. I was already at that particular stage of alcohol consumption where the filter was gone, but the coordination was still functional, which is the most dangerous stage because nothing stops the words and the body is still capable of carrying them somewhere. He crossed the room with the slow, deliberate walk of a man who believed he was being watched and wanted to make sure he was being watched correctly. Emily heard him coming. She didn't turn around. She turned a page. He put both hands on the bar on either side of her novel, leaning in close enough that she could smell the whiskey in the specific chemical confidence of someone who had never once in his adult life been made to genuinely reckon with himself. "Little quiet over here," he said. Emily looked up. She looked at him the way a person looks at something they have assessed and categorized and moved past in the time it takes most people to register that something is happening. "I'm reading," she said. "What branch?" She paused. "Navy." Something shifted in his expression, not quite an amusement, something that wanted to be contempt but hadn't fully decided yet. "Officer Lieutenant." He made a sound, low and dismissive, like the word meant less coming from her than it would from someone else. "What's your unit?" he asked. "Supply Administration." "I'm not discussing my assignment in a bar," Emily said. She looked back down at her book. And that was the moment, that precise moment, when she looked back down at her book. That was the thing Ryan Mitchell could not tolerate. Not because she'd been rude, she hadn't been. Not because she'd challenged him, she hadn't done that either. She had simply indicated with one small and perfectly calibrated gesture that she considered the conversation finished. That she had looked at him, assessed the situation, and decided it wasn't worth her continued attention. For a man like Ryan Mitchell, that was the worst possible response she could have given. "You know," he said, his voice getting louder now, loud enough that the two people sitting nearest on either side of the bar began quietly creating distance. "I've never understood the whole female operator thing. I really haven't." He looked back at his table. His men were watching. Some of them were uncomfortable and hoping this would stop. Others were leaning forward slightly. "You put women in special operations, what you get is units that have to slow down for the weakest person. That's just biology. That's not an opinion. That's a fact." Emily didn't look up. "You didn't hear me," Ryan said. "I heard you," she said. Her voice was completely level. "Then maybe you want to explain to me why you're sitting here alone at a bar on a Friday night, reading a book, instead of being home with your family like a normal woman." A bartender at the far end looked up from wiping a glass. He was a retired Marine named Cal who had seen approximately 10,000 versions of this exact type of situation in 30 years of running bars near military installations, and he was already moving his hand toward his phone. Emily placed her thumb inside the novel to mark her page. She closed it carefully. She set it down on the bar with the same deliberateness you'd use to set down something fragile. She looked at Ryan Mitchell. "I think you should go back to your table," she said. There was nothing hostile in her voice. No trembling, no pleading, no anger. She said it the same way a very experienced pilot says, "I'm going to need you to return to your seat right before they do something technical and precise to prevent a catastrophe." Calm, absolute, inarguable. And that calm, that complete and total absence of fear or agitation, was what broke something open in Ryan Mitchell. Because the only response he knew to that kind of stillness was noise. "You don't get to tell me what to do, Lieutenant," he said, and the word lieutenant came out of his mouth like a slur. "Not here, not ever." He pointed at the ribbons that weren't there because she wasn't in uniform, and then he laughed at himself for doing it, and the laugh was ugly. "Women in special operations, you know what I think happened? I think they lowered the standards. I think they changed the numbers on the tests and called it equal, because there is no way beyond them." "There is no way what?" Emily said. "Just that, quiet, direct, no edge." He leaned in closer. "There is no way," he said very low now, "that someone who looks like you has ever actually done anything that would make you worth taking seriously in a combat environment. You want to play soldier, fine, play soldier. But don't sit here acting like you belong in the same conversation as these men. The bar was almost entirely silent now. 12 rangers at the back, table 11 of whom were somewhere on the spectrum between deeply uncomfortable and actively ashamed of what was happening. Decker had his eyes on the bar top. One of the older guys, a staff sergeant named Ortega, had his jaw set in a way that said he would be having a very different kind of conversation with Ryan about this later somewhere private. And then Ryan Mitchell did the thing that nobody in that room would be able to stop thinking about for months afterward. He raised his hand, and he hit her, open palm, right side of her face. Not a tap, not a theatrical gesture designed to be stopped before contact. An actual deliberate physical strike across the face of a woman he had decided in his alcohol-soaked and ego-driven logic had disrespected him by being exactly what she was. The sound was shockingly loud. Emily's head moved with it, not because she wasn't fast enough to avoid it, and everyone who would later analyze this moment in detail would understand that, but because sometimes the wisest thing you can do in a moment of sudden violence is absorb it and let it be witnessed completely. Let it be real. Let it be recorded by every single person in the room in a way that cannot be disputed or reframed or diminished later. She turned her head back. There was a small line of blood on her lower lip where it had caught her tooth. She looked at Ryan Mitchell. He was already stepping back, and in the micro-expression that crossed his face in the half-second before his performance reasserted itself, there was something that might have been the very first genuine shock he'd felt in years. Because she hadn't flinched before impact. Because she wasn't crying now. Because her eyes looking back at him contained no fear whatsoever. Only something he couldn't quite name. Something that made the triumph he'd expected to feel taste like copper. Behind him, Decker stood up from the table. Sarge, Ryan, that's enough. That is enough. Ortega was already on his feet. Mitchell, sit down, right now. Ryan held up one hand. She's fine, he said, and his voice had gotten loud again, the performance rebuilding itself over the crack that had just appeared. She's fine. Women in the military, they want equal treatment, right? They want to be treated like one of the guys. He looked around the room, reaching for a crowd that had stopped being a crowd and had become 37 individual witnesses. That's equal. Emily stood up. She did it slowly. She pressed a paper napkin against her lip. She looked at it. She set it down. She picked up her novel. She put it in the canvas bag she had hanging over the back of the bar stool. She looked at Ryan Mitchell one more time. I'm done here, she said. That was all. She turned and walked toward the door with the unhurried, measured pace of someone who had made a decision and was executing it. No storming out, no dramatic exit, just movement, purposeful and entirely terrifyingly controlled. The door closed behind her. For 3 full seconds, the bar was completely silent. And then Ryan Mitchell laughed. He laughed the way men laugh when they need the room to agree with them, when the laugh is actually a question disguised as a statement. He turned back toward his table and spread his hands. See, he said, that's what I'm talking about. Nobody at his table laughed. Decker sat back down and stared at his drink and did not look up. Ortega walked around the table and picked up his jacket. Where are you going? Ryan said. I'm done here too, Ortega said. And in the silence that followed, that if Ryan Mitchell had been able to hear past his own noise for just one moment, he might have recognized the exact sound of the beginning of the end of something. But he couldn't, and so he didn't. What Ryan Mitchell did not know, what none of the Rangers at that table knew, what the bartender Cal didn't know, and what the 35 other witnesses in that bar couldn't have known, was the specific weight of the woman who had just walked out that door. They didn't know about the 8-month deployment that had ended 11 days ago. They didn't know about the hostage rescue in a location that remained classified at the highest level, in which Emily Carter had been one of 4 operators who went into a situation where the odds of all 4 coming back out alive were estimated in the debrief at approximately 30%. All 4 came back. The people they went in for also came back. The debrief lasted 3 days. They didn't know about the combat action ribbon, or the Bronze Star, or the classified commendation that existed in a file that most people in the United States military would never be cleared to access. They didn't know that Emily Carter had been in the water for 4 continuous hours during a training exercise the previous year at night in 48-degree ocean temperature as part of a qualification test that had a failure rate above 70%. They didn't know that she had come out of that water and immediately reported for debrief without requesting medical attention, despite a core temperature that should have sent her to a hospital. They didn't know that she had been invited to address a panel at the Naval War College on the psychological dimensions of sustained, high-stress covert operations, that she had declined because she preferred to be operational rather than academic, that the person who extended the invitation had told her commanding officer that Emily Carter was, in his professional view, among the 5 most psychologically resilient operators he had assessed in 22 years. They didn't know any of that. And standing at the door of the Anchor, watching her walk away into the cool October night, Ryan Mitchell believed with total confidence that he had won something. He had no idea what he had actually started. Emily did not go home. She sat in her car in the parking lot of the Anchor for 11 minutes. She sat very still, the way she had learned to be still during training. Not the stillness of someone who has shut down, but the stillness of someone who is processing at full speed internally while presenting nothing to the external environment. Her lip had stopped bleeding. She was not crying. She was not thinking about Ryan Mitchell. She was running a decision tree. She had learned over years of high-stakes operational work that the moments immediately following a significant event were not the moments for emotion. They were the moments for clarity. Emotion was information. She respected it, she listened to it, but it was not a plan. And what this situation required immediately was a plan. She knew the law. She knew the Uniform Code of Military Justice. She knew what 32 CFR Part 105 said about reporting requirements for incidents involving commissioned officers. She knew that she had been struck by a fellow service member in front of witnesses. She knew that she had options, and she knew that the most powerful of those options was not the one that would feel the best in the next 10 minutes. She took out her phone. She called her JAG officer friend, the only person she knew who answered calls at 9:45 on Friday nights without asking why, and she said 4 sentences. I need you to walk me through the formal reporting process for a physical assault by a service member. Yes, tonight. Yes, there are witnesses. I want everything documented before anyone sleeps on this. Her friend's voice changed register immediately. Tell me everything. So Emily told her. She told her with the same precision and completeness that she used in operational debriefs. Dates, times, exact words, physical description of the assailant, number of witnesses, proximity of security cameras she had noted on her way in and out of the bar, the bartender's name because she had read it off his name tag before she left. Because Emily Carter didn't just walk into rooms. She processed rooms. It was not a habit or a hobby. It was a survival mechanism built over years of training and operational necessity. When she walked into the Anchor that night, she had automatically logged 2 exits, 1 security camera above the register, 1 above the front door. Bartender name, license plates of vehicles in the closest parking spots, 2 individuals near the back who were carrying concealed, 3 people at the bar who showed signs of significant alcohol impairment. She had noted Ryan Mitchell when he first started looking at her. She had categorized him within 30 seconds. She had made her decision about how to handle his approach before he'd taken 3 steps toward her. She had let it play out anyway because the only way for what happened to be documented properly was to let it happen in front of witnesses and cameras. And that decision, that choice to absorb the blow rather than deflect it, was one of the most deliberately strategic things she had ever done in her life. Her JAG friend said when she was done, "You understand what this is going to mean." "I know what it means," Emily said. "It's going to be a formal proceeding. It's going to be, I know. And this guy, his rank, his unit. His rank and unit don't change what he did. They don't change what's documented. And they don't change what happens next." Her friend was quiet for a moment, then, "Okay, I want a written account from you timestamped before midnight tonight. Can you do that? It'll be in your inbox in 40 minutes. And Emily, I want you to know what you're doing right now. Walking away from that and doing this instead of..." She stopped. "You know what I mean." "I know," Emily said. "Most people wouldn't." Emily looked out through her windshield at the neon sign above the door of the Anchor. She watched a couple come out laughing, one of them stumbling a little, the other catching them. Ordinary, human, exactly the kind of thing that she'd been trying to be part of tonight. "Most people," Emily said quietly, "don't understand that walking away isn't losing. Sometimes walking away is the most precise thing you can do." She started her car. She drove home. She sat at her kitchen table and she wrote 19 pages of the most carefully organized, emotionally precise, factually complete account of those events that anyone who would later read it had ever seen in a formal complaint document. She wrote it the way she'd been trained to write operational reports, every detail in sequence, every observation supported by a secondary confirming detail, every claim presented with the evidence available to support it. She finished at 12 minutes after midnight. She sent it. Then she made herself a cup of tea, sat back down at the table, opened her novel to page 247, and read until 3 in the morning. Blam! Saturday morning arrived gray and cool, and carrying the particular quiet that military bases take on at Route 600 on weekends, when most of the base has been given leave. Emily was already at the administrative office when it opened. She was in uniform. She had slept 4 hours. She looked like she had slept 8. The duty officer who processed her paperwork was a young ensign who had been in the Navy for 14 months and who in the subsequent 3 years would tell the story of the morning. Had checked in Lieutenant Emily Carter's complaint to every class of junior officers he ever had occasion to address. Not because of the paperwork, because of the expression on Emily's face when she handed it over. "Ma'am," he said, looking at the thickness of the documentation she placed in front of him, "is there anything you want me to flag as priority?" "All of it is priority," she said, "but particularly the request for surveillance footage from the 2 cameras I've identified and the list of potential witnesses. I'd like those contacts made before end of business Monday." He looked up at her. "Did you sleep last night, ma'am?" She almost smiled. "Some. You should know that I mean this kind of report with this level of documentation." "I know," she said. "That's why I documented it this way." She left the administrative office. She stopped at the base commissary and bought an orange, a container of Greek yogurt, and a bottle of water. She sat on a bench outside the commissary in the gray October morning and ate her breakfast and watched seabirds circle in the distance over the water, and she did not think about Ryan Mitchell at all. She was thinking about Monday, because Monday was when something was going to happen that neither Ryan Mitchell nor anyone in his unit had any reason to expect. And Emily Carter, who had spent years learning how to be patient in situations where patience was the difference between success and catastrophe, was exactly as ready for it as she always was for anything, which was completely. Ryan Mitchell woke up Saturday morning with a headache that he told himself was a 2-drink headache, but was actually a 6-drink headache because he had kept drinking after Emily left and the bar had gradually emptied of his men until it was just him and 2 strangers who didn't know him and therefore couldn't validate the version of the story he was constructing. He lay on his back in his bunk on base. He was staying in temporary accommodations during the training exercise rotation and stared at the ceiling and let the previous night reassemble itself. Here is what Ryan Mitchell's vision of the previous night looked like. And he had confronted a female officer who was clearly out of her depth in an environment she didn't belong in. She had been cold and dismissive, which he had correctly identified as arrogance beyond her rank. He had made his point. She had left. End of story. The hit. He turned it over in his mind the way you turn over something that you can see might be a problem, but that you very much want to not be a problem. She was fine. She'd walked out under her own power. It was a single open-handed strike. In the context of men who regularly subjected themselves to things that could kill them as part of their professional training. It was, and he actually used this word inside his own mind, at 0730 on a Saturday morning minor. She wouldn't report it. Women in the military didn't report things like this. Not because things like this didn't happen. He was smart enough to know they happened. But because reporting it created problems for the woman too. Made her look like she couldn't handle herself. Made her peers wonder about her. That was the reality of the system, even if it was an ugly reality. And Emily Carter was too smart, too clearly career conscious to blow up a formal proceeding over a bar altercation. She'd handle it quietly. Maybe complain to someone she trusted. Maybe not even that. She'd walk it off. He was confident of this. He made himself a protein shake from the supplies he kept in a small case under his bunk, drank it standing at the narrow window that looked out over the base, and began mentally preparing for the joint training program that was starting Monday morning. He'd been briefed on it last week. Navy-Army Joint Advanced Combat Program. He and his Rangers had been rotated in as the Army contingent. It was a 2-week program intensive with assessments at each phase. He was expected to lead his team through it and come out with the kind of scores that would look good for the next review board. He hadn't been told who the Navy was sending to run it. That information, as it happened, would reach him on Sunday evening, by which time the formal complaint documentation would already be logged, time-stamped, assigned to an investigator, and sitting in a file folder with Ryan Mitchell's name on it. But Sunday evening was still more than 30 hours away. And Ryan Mitchell spent those 30 hours in the comfortable certainty of a man who believes that what he cannot see does not exist. Decker found Ortega in the gym at 0800 Saturday morning and said straight out, no preamble, "We need to talk about last night." Ortega set down the weight he was holding. He had been waiting for this. "What do you want to say?" Ortega asked. "I want to know if you're going to report it," Decker said. He was 26 years old and had been a Ranger for 3 years and had spent most of his career genuinely looking up to Ryan Mitchell, which made what he was feeling right now particularly destabilizing. "Because I've been up since 4 thinking about it, and I don't know what the right thing to do is, and I think you do." Ortega was quiet for a long moment. "I think," Ortega said carefully, "that she's going to handle it herself, and I think she's going to handle it better than either of us could. But that doesn't mean we're off the hook for what we saw. If someone asks us, officially asks us, we tell the truth, all of it, every word he said and what he did. And if nobody asks," Ortega picked the weight back up. "Someone's going to ask," he said. "Trust me on that." Decker stood there for another moment. Then he nodded. Then he went and got on the treadmill at the far end of the gym and ran 7 miles at a pace that was significantly faster than he normally ran, because he needed somewhere to put everything he was feeling, and running was the only place he knew. Sunday evening, the briefing document for Monday's joint training program was distributed to all participating unit leaders. Program Coordinator Lieutenant Emily J. Carter, U.S. Navy SEALs. Ryan Mitchell read her name. He read it 3 times. He sat very still on the edge of his bunk, and he read her name for the 3rd time, and then he set the paper down on the blanket beside him, and he stared at the wall. And in the silence of his quarters on Sunday evening, something began very slowly to shift in Ryan Mitchell's chest. It was not guilt yet. Guilt would take longer. What it was on Sunday evening was the first faint and deeply uncomfortable recognition that the woman he had hit on Friday night, the woman he had dismissed and categorized and decided was a problem he had handled, had not in fact been handled, had not in any sense of the word been diminished, was going to be standing in front of him tomorrow morning with the authority of the United States Navy behind her and a formal complaint in a file with his name on it, and 19 pages of documentation written with the precision of someone who had spent years doing things in the dark that people like Ryan Mitchell were never cleared to know about. He picked up his phone. He thought about calling his commanding officer. He put the phone down. He thought about calling his JAG contact. He put that thought down too. He lay back on his bunk and stared at the ceiling and tried to reconstruct his confidence, and found that it kept sliding away from him like water through open hands. Monday was coming, and Emily Carter was ready for it. Whether Ryan Mitchell was or not, Monday, 05:45 hours. The training facility was a converted warehouse complex that the Navy had been using for joint programs for 11 years. It was not a glamorous building. The floors were concrete. The walls were cinder block, painted industrial gray. The overhead lighting was the kind that buzzed faintly and made everyone look like they hadn't slept. It smelled like rubber matting and old sweat and the specific chemical residue of equipment that had been cleaned 1,000 times but still carried the memory of every person who had ever used it. Ryan Mitchell arrived at 05:45 because he always arrived 15 minutes early to any professional engagement. 15 minutes early communicated readiness. It communicated discipline. It communicated that you were the kind of leader who set the standard rather than following it. He walked into the main briefing room expecting to be the first one there. Emily Carter was already seated at the front table with 3 folders open in front of her, a cup of coffee at her right hand, and her eyes moving through a document with the focused efficiency of someone who had been there long enough to have finished 2 previous tasks. She did not look up when he entered. Ryan stopped just inside the doorway. His Rangers filed in behind him and spread out across the rows of chairs, and the room filled with the low-level sounds of men settling in chairs, scraping equipment, being set down, the muted conversations of people who were awake but not yet fully committed to being awake. Ryan walked to the first row and sat down. He looked at the back of Emily's bent head. She turned a page. He had rehearsed several versions of this moment during the previous night, none of which had involved him sitting in a chair while she read a document, and all of which had somehow allowed him to feel like he had more control over the situation than he was currently experiencing. At exactly 0600, Emily closed the top folder, picked up her coffee, stood up, and turned around. She looked at the room. 41 personnel, 12 Army Rangers, 29 Navy operators and support staff, one program coordinator who had 19 pages of formal complaint documentation in a file with Ryan Mitchell's name on it, sitting in the administrative office 2 buildings away. "Good morning," she said. Her voice was clear and even and completely unremarkable, which was somehow its own kind of authority. "I'm Lieutenant Carter. I'm running this program. You have 2 weeks. The program is designed to be hard. It will be harder than you think going in and easier than you think it was when you come out the other side, which is the nature of all worthwhile things. We will start with a physical baseline assessment at 0630. Questions. Nobody asked a question. Good, she said. One thing before we begin. This program does not care what branch you serve. It does not care what unit you're from. It does not care about your previous record, your reputation, or what you've been told about yourself by people who weren't watching you in the conditions that actually matter." She paused for exactly 1 second. "It cares about what you do here in the next 2 weeks. That's all. Move out at 0620. She picked up her pointers and walked out of the briefing room. The room stayed quiet for 3 more seconds after she left. Then Decker leaned over to the ranger sitting next to him and said very quietly, "We are in serious trouble." "Trouble?" Ryan Mitchell said nothing. He sat in the front row with his jaw set and his eyes on the door through which Emily Carter had just walked, and he told himself one more time, with slightly less conviction than the previous several attempts, that he had the situation under control. He did not have the situation under control. The baseline assessment at 0630 was the first confirmation of this. It was not a standard fitness test. Emily had designed this particular assessment herself, and what it measured was not raw physical performance. What it measured was decision-making under sustained physical stress, which is an entirely different skill set and one that many elite operators who are excellent under controlled conditions discover to their significant discomfort that they are substantially worse at than they believed. The assessment involved a 6-mile run that changed route based on instructions delivered through earpieces at irregular intervals, requiring participants to process and execute navigational decisions while maintaining pace. It involved a water obstacle that required a partner to be supported through a submerged section while the supporting operator had no breathing assistance. And it involved a final tactical decision-making problem delivered verbally at the end of the physical component, when heart rates were elevated and cognitive reserves were genuinely depleted. Ryan Mitchell was fast. He had always been fast. His cardiovascular baseline was exceptional, and his physical training was methodical and consistent. He completed the 6-mile component in the top 3 of all 41 participants. He missed the 3rd route change because the instruction was delivered at the same moment a ranger ahead of him stumbled, and Ryan's focus moved to the immediate situation rather than the audio in his ear. The miss cost him a 400-meter correction that knocked him from 3rd to 9th. He completed the water obstacle successfully, though the partner he supported, a younger ranger who was struggling, cost them 12 seconds on the target time. At the end, breathing, hard sweat-soaked, he received the verbal decision problem. Scenario. You have 3 operators, 2 injured. 1. Route compromise, an extraction window of 9 minutes in 2 possible courses of action with different risk profiles. Ryan gave the tactically aggressive answer. It was the answer that prioritized speed. In the scenario, it resulted in a simulated loss of one of the injured operators. He found out his score 3 hours later. He stood in the hallway outside the assessment office and looked at the number and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt like a person who had made assumptions about himself that the evidence was not supporting. Inside the assessment office, Emily was reviewing scores with her 2 senior evaluators. They went through the results, methodically marking patterns, flagging outliers. Mitchell, one of the evaluators, said a Navy senior chief named Torres, who had been running assessments for 9 years. Physical component top tier, decision-making component bottom quartile. I know, Emily said. Interesting gap. It's a consistent profile, she said. She made a note. High physical confidence, reduced cognitive flexibility under stress. We'll watch it through the week. Torres glanced at her. He knew in the way that people who work closely together in professional environments always eventually know that something had happened between his program coordinator and the Army Ranger, whose name was now in a file in the admin building. He didn't know the details. He didn't need the details to see the shape of the thing. You want me to, he started. No, Emily said. We run it exactly the same for everyone. I want his real scores, not managed ones. Torres nodded. That was the answer he'd expected. It was also, he thought as he went back to the score sheets, the answer that told you everything you needed to know about who Emily Carter was. Ryan Mitchell spent the lunch hour sitting alone at a table in the far corner of the commissary, which was significant because Ryan Mitchell never sat alone at lunch. He was a group person. He needed the orbit of other people, the way some people needed light. Sitting alone was an admission that something was different, and he made it anyway because the alternative was sitting with his Rangers and performing normalcy, and he didn't have enough left in him at noon on Monday to do that convincingly. Decker saw him there. He picked up his tray and walked over and sat down across from him without asking permission, which was the prerogative of someone who had known another person long enough to understand when asking permission was the wrong move. Ryan looked up. Don't, Ryan said. I'm not going to say anything, Decker said. He started eating. They sat in silence for almost 2 full minutes, which is an extremely long silence between people who know each other well. Then Ryan said, How did you do on the decision problem? I got it wrong too, Decker said. Different reason, same outcome. What was your reason? Decker put his fork down. I second-guessed myself at the last second. I had the right answer, and then I talked myself out of it because I was tired, and tired people don't trust themselves. He paused. What was yours? Ryan was quiet. Ryan? I went aggressive, Ryan said. I prioritized speed. Decker was quiet for a moment. Then he said very carefully, Is that what you did at the bar Friday night? Prioritize speed over don't. Ryan's voice was hard. Decker picked his fork back up. Okay, he said, and he didn't say anything else. But the question had been asked, and it was in the room now, sitting on the table between them, like something solid, and Ryan could feel it for the rest of the meal. The afternoon session was even more difficult than the morning. It was a series of leadership rotations in which each unit leader was placed in command of a mixed team Navy and Army personnel together and given an objective with incomplete information and a time constraint that made perfect execution impossible. The point was not to achieve the objective. The point was to make the best decisions available with what you had, adapt when the information changed, and bring your team through it without losing cohesion. Emily ran the observation deck with Torres and 2 other senior evaluators watching through a glass partition taking notes. Ryan's first rotation was his worst. I took control of the mixed team with the same manner he used with his Rangers, a manner that worked with his Rangers because they knew him, trusted him, understood his shorthand, and found it immediately ineffective with the Navy personnel on the team who did not respond to that particular frequency. When his instructions weren't followed with the speed he expected, he escalated his tone. When escalating his tone didn't produce the result he wanted, he went around 2 of the Navy operators and executed the decision himself rather than communicating it through them. The objective was partially completed. The team came out of the rotation fragmented. One of the Navy operators, a woman named Reyes, who was 22 years old and on her first joint program, came off the floor, looking shaken in the specific way of someone who has been in a leadership environment that didn't feel safe. Emily noted it. After the rotations, she walked the floor. She stopped at each participant, asked a question, listened to the answer, made a note. She reached Reyes and said, How are you doing? Fine, ma'am, Reyes said. The automatic answer, the military answer. That's not what I asked, Emily said. Reyes looked at her. Something shifted in the young woman's expression, the professional mask loosening by a fraction, the human being underneath it briefly visible. It was a hard rotation, Reyes said. What made it hard? Reyes glanced around. The team leader, she stopped. You can be specific, Emily said. This conversation is part of my assessment notes. It stays in the program. Reyes took a breath. I didn't know what he wanted from me. He gave an instruction, and when I asked him to clarify it, he redid it himself and moved on. I felt like I wasn't there. Got it, Emily said. She made a note. Thank you for telling me. She moved on. Ryan was watching from across the room. He couldn't hear the conversation, but he could see Emily talking to Reyes. He could see Reyes's face. And something about watching that particular exchange, Emily leaning slightly forward, fully present, Reyes's expression shifting from closed to something more open, landed on him differently than he expected. Han had spent the last 3 days constructing a version of Emily Carter that made his behavior on Friday night make sense. The version where she was arrogant or cold or technically qualified, but personally objectionable in some way that justified his response. He had needed that version. He had worked on it with real effort. And watching her take 4 minutes with a junior operator who was shaken and make that operator feel like what she experienced was worth hearing, that version started developing structural problems. He didn't examine that feeling. He wasn't ready to examine it. He went back to his equipment check and put it away. The first full day ended at 1800. Emily walked back to her office, sat down, and spent 45 minutes writing individual notes on each participant. When she got to Ryan Mitchell's entry, she wrote more than she had for anyone else. She wrote it with precision and without emotion, the way she would write any professional assessment. She noted the physical excellence in the decision-making gaps. She noted the leadership friction in the mixed team rotation. She noted Rhea's account. She did not note what happened Friday night. That was in a different file managed by different people moving through a different process. These were separate things. She kept them separate on purpose. When she was done, she picked up her phone and checked for messages from her JAG contact. There was one, 3 words, interview scheduled Wednesday. She read it. She set the phone face down on the desk. She picked up her pen and went back to her notes. Tuesday arrived the way. Second days always arrive in hard programs, faster than you expect, with less recovery in between than you plan for, and with the knowledge of what's coming sitting on your chest before you fully open your eyes. Ryan Mitchell was at the facility at Bo 540, 5 minutes earlier than Monday. He wasn't sure what he was trying to prove by that. He arrived to find Emily already there again, and this time he understood that she was not arriving early to establish dominance. She was arriving early because she was someone who arrived early. That was just who she was. The consistency of it, the second morning of it, made it impossible to frame as a performance. He sat down in the second row this time instead of the first. Small things tell you large things about what's happening inside a person. Tuesday's program focused on underwater operations. It was the component that most filtered out participants who were physically capable in dry environments from those who were genuinely comfortable in the specific psychological challenge of operating in water, managing buoyancy, navigation, breath control, task execution, all simultaneously in conditions that triggered deep biological fear responses that even highly trained operators felt and had to consciously override. Ryan's Rangers were good. They were generally strong swimmers, and their water confidence was above average for Army personnel. Several of them were exceptional, but Emily Carter in the water was a different category of thing. The first exercise was a solo underwater navigation drill, a specific course laid out on the pool floor, completed without visual aids, navigated by the physical memory of trained pattern recognition. Emily ran it as a demonstration, first the way program coordinators always ran demonstrations. She entered the water without drama, disappeared under the surface. The room watched the clock. She came up on the other side at 1 minute and 53 seconds. The Navy evaluator beside the pool said, for the record, "That's the course record for this facility." The room was quiet. Ryan Mitchell, standing with his Rangers at the edge of the pool, felt the quiet settle on him specifically. Decker made a small sound beside him. Not words, just a sound that acknowledged something large was happening. One of the younger Rangers, a kid named Pruitt, who was 23 and had the sincere, uncomplicated admiration for genuine skill that you can only have before life has complicated your relationship with admiration, said "holy," and then stopped himself and looked at Ryan for a read on how to feel. Ryan gave him nothing. He had nothing to give. He watched Emily pull herself out of the pool at the far end, accept a towel from Torres, and say something to him that made him write quickly in his notes. And he thought about Friday night, and he thought about a woman sitting alone at a bar, reading a book about a mountain. And he thought about what he'd said before he hit her, and he thought about the word minor that he had applied to what he'd done when he was lying on his bunk on Saturday morning. None of it was holding together the way it had been. He completed the underwater navigation drill at 2 minutes and 41 seconds. which was the best time in the Ranger contingent. In the combined ranking, it placed him seventh. Seventh out of 41 was genuinely good. It didn't feel good. That was new information about himself that he didn't particularly want. The afternoon of Tuesday brought the leadership workshop that Emily had designed as a companion to Monday's rotation exercises. It was classroom-based, which some of the participants had secretly looked forward to as a lighter component, and which was in fact not lighter at all. Emily led the session herself. She stood at the front and worked through a series of leadership case studies that she presented without drama, asking the group to analyze decisions and outcomes. She was precise. She was direct. She asked follow-up questions that caught people who were giving surface answers and made them go deeper. She created a room where being wrong was clearly safe and being dishonest about what you actually thought was clearly not. About an hour in, she presented a case study that Ryan recognized. It was disguised. The branch was different. The location was different. The specific details were altered. But the structure of it was the specific leadership failure he had made in Monday's rotation. The decision to execute personally rather than communicate through the team. The result: fractured cohesion, reduced effectiveness. One team member operationally marginalized. She presented it without looking at him, but several people in the room looked at him. And Emily, without ever making the connection explicit, led a 20-minute discussion in which 41 operators systematically dismantled exactly what he had done and explained in clear and specific terms why it was a leadership failure that endangered everyone who depended on the person making it. At the end of the case study, Emily said, "The leader in this scenario was technically excellent. His individual performance was above average in almost every measured category. The failure wasn't about skill. It was about the inability to trust other people's competence at the moment when trusting it felt least comfortable, which is exactly when trusting it matters most." She moved to the next case study. Ryan Mitchell sat in his chair with something happening in his chest that he could not have named yet, but that felt like the slow, unwelcome dismantling of a structure he had spent a very long time building. After the workshop, when the room was clearing out, Ortega fell into step beside him in the hallway. They walked for a moment in silence. Then Ortega said, "She knows." "She always knew," Ryan said. "I mean, she knows how to do this without," Ortega paused, choosing the word, "without making it about Friday night. She's running a real program. Everything she's showing you about yourself, it's real. It has nothing to do with the bar." Ryan said nothing. "That's actually worse," Ortega said. "Isn't it?" It was not a question. Ryan kept walking. Tuesday night, Ryan Mitchell did something he had not done in longer than he could precisely remember. He sat alone in his quarters with his phone face down and his door closed, and he tried to have an honest conversation with himself. Not the internal conversation where you present yourself with evidence and then argue against it until you win. The other kind. The kind that feels like standing on cold tile in bare feet, slightly uncomfortable grounding, clarifying. I went back to Friday night, and he stopped defending his arrival at Emily's position at the bar. He stopped defending the things he said. He stopped using the word minor. He sat with what he'd actually done. He had looked at a woman who was quieter and stiller and more contained than he was, and he had decided that her quiet was a challenge to him, that her containment was an insult to him. He had decided those things without a single piece of evidence to support them, because he had needed to decide them because the alternative was acknowledging that she was exactly what she appeared to be, someone who was simply not performing for him, someone whose world did not include him as a variable. And he had been unable to tolerate that. So he had tried to force himself into her world with the tools he had available. He sat with that for a long time. He picked up his phone. He looked at his commanding officer's number. He put the phone back down. Not yet. Not until he understood more completely what he was going to say. He lay back on his bunk. Above him, the ceiling of the temporary quarters was the same industrial gray as the training facility walls, and he stared at it in the dark, and he thought about 2 minutes and 41 seconds and what it had felt like to come up out of the water and know, without being told, that someone else had done it faster, and to know also, without being told, that the gap between those two times was not a gap that additional training was going to close, because it wasn't about the water. It was about something he had been calling strength for his entire career that he was beginning to understand was actually something else, something he didn't have a clean word for yet. He was 34 years old, lying in the dark in a temporary bunk on a base in California, and for the first time in his professional life, he was genuinely uncertain whether the version of himself that he had been operating from was the person he actually wanted to be. That uncertainty felt like falling. But it also, underneath the falling, felt like something else. Something that, if he let it keep going, might eventually feel like landing. Wednesday morning arrived, and with it, the thing Ryan had been told was coming, without being told the details. At 0900, a military investigator named Captain Holloway knocked on the door of the administrative office where Ryan's assigned JAG liaison was already waiting. Holloway was a compact, measured woman with 20 years of investigative experience and a manner of operating that was the institutional equivalent of Emily Carter's thorough, quiet, and utterly without performance. She sat across from Ryan's JAG liaison and placed a folder on the table. "We have a formal complaint," she said. "Filed Saturday morning. We have surveillance footage from 2 cameras. We have witness accounts from 7 individuals, including 3 members of Sergeant Mitchell's own unit. We have a written account from the complainant that is 19 pages long. Timestamp 12 a.m. Saturday morning." Ryan's JAG liaison, a young captain named Freed, who had been doing this job for 6 years, looked at the folder and said, very carefully, "Has Sergeant Mitchell been notified?" "His notice is being delivered this morning," Holloway said. "He'll have 48 hours to provide a formal response. The tribunal has been scheduled provisionally for 2 weeks from Thursday." Freed sat back. "The complainant, Carter. Lieutenant Emily Carter, yes. Can I see the surveillance footage?" Holloway opened her laptop and turned it toward him. Freed watched it. He watched it without expression, the professional face that people in his job developed because showing reaction was not useful, and he had learned that early. But when the footage ended, he sat still for a moment longer than professional blankness required. "That's clear," he said. "Yes," Holloway said. "It's very clear." 80917. A master sergeant knocked on the door of the tactical training room where Ryan was working through the morning's first exercise and handed him an envelope. Ryan took it. He read the first page. He handed it back. "Sir," the master sergeant said. "I don't need you to take it back," Ryan said. His voice was completely level. "I'm saying I've read it." He put the envelope in the interior pocket of his training jacket. He went back to the exercise. He finished it. His score was slightly worse than Tuesday. Not dramatically, but measurably. At lunch, he sat with his Rangers, which he had not done Monday or Tuesday. He sat there and he ate his food, and he answered direct questions, and he didn't initiate anything. Decker watched him from across the table with the careful attention of someone who cares about another person and is not certain what shape that caring needs to take right now. At 1:30, Emily ran the afternoon session, a combined land navigation problem that required mixed Navy-Army teams to work through a series of decision points together, communicating in real time, managing conflicting information, and arriving at consensus under time pressure. Ryan was on a team with a Navy SEAL senior chief named Watts, who was 41 years old and had the relaxed authority of someone who no longer needed to prove anything to anyone and had therefore become genuinely effective at everything. Watts watched Ryan for the first 2 decision points without saying much. At the 3rd point, when Ryan made a recommendation that Watts assessed as too fast, Watts said quietly, "Hold on, run it again." Ryan looked at him. "I've run it. This is the right call." "Maybe," Watts said. "Run it again anyway. What's the cost if you're wrong?" Ryan ran it again. He was wrong. He revised. "Good," Watts said. "No drama, no point being made, just acknowledgement." Ryan looked at him. "You knew I was wrong before I ran it again." "Yeah," Watts said. "Why didn't you just say so?" Watts shrugged. "Because you needed to see it yourself. Telling you doesn't do anything. You seeing it is the whole thing." They moved to the next decision point. Ryan Mitchell ran it again. He got it right this time, and something very small and very quiet shifted in the way he was holding himself. Not repentance, not transformation, not even clarity yet. Just the very first millimeter of something opening that he hadn't known was closed. By Wednesday evening, the formal complaint was fully in motion. By Thursday morning, it would be documented in the record. By the time the 2-week program ended, the tribunal would be 19 days away. But what was happening in the training facility, in the daily grind of exercises and assessments and workshops and team rotations, was something that existed alongside the formal process and did not overlap with it in any way Emily had not explicitly intended. She was not using the program to punish Ryan Mitchell. She was running a program. That was the thing that Ortega had identified and that Decker was beginning to understand, and that Ryan himself was only now at the tail end of Wednesday beginning to perceive the shape of. The program was real. The standards were real. And the woman running it was precisely without performance or management or calculation, who she had been sitting at the bar on Friday night reading a book about a woman climbing a mountain. She was not doing this for Ryan Mitchell. She was doing it because it was the thing she did. And the fact that he was in the room for it was the most devastatingly effective thing that could possibly have happened to him. More effective than any punch he might have expected her to throw back on Friday night. More permanent than any retaliation he had been waiting for, embracing against, and had not received. Because punches heal. But being made to watch your own reflection in the work of someone you dismissed and discovering that the reflection is less complete than you thought, that stays. That stays for a very long time. Emily finished her Wednesday session notes at 18:45 and drove back to her apartment and heated up soup and sat at the kitchen table with her phone and called her sister, who wanted to talk about bridesmaid dress colors, and asked if Emily had any preference, and Emily said she trusted her sister's judgment completely, and her sister said, "That's what you always say." And Emily said, "Because I always mean it." And her sister laughed and said, "How are you for real?" And Emily was quiet for a moment. "I'm okay," she said. "You're doing that thing where okay means something is happening, but you can't say what." "Little bit," Emily admitted. "Are you safe?" "Yes," Emily said, without hesitation. "Okay," her sister said. "I love you." "I love you too," Emily said. She hung up. She finished her soup. She read 12 more pages of The Woman on K2. Thursday was coming, and Emily Carter was ready, as she always was, as she had always been. The way you are when you have spent years learning the difference between reacting and responding, between speed and precision, between winning a moment and winning the thing that matters. The tribunal was 19 days away, but the real reckoning was already happening daily in the facility, with the gray walls, in the buzzing lights, in the pool where she had set a record without trying, in front of 41 people who were now seeing with increasing clarity exactly who she was. And who was the person she was standing across from? Thursday, 0630 hours. The third day of the program hit differently than the first two. Not because the exercises were harder, though they were. Not because the stakes had changed, though they had. It hit differently because by the third day, everyone in that facility understood that something larger than a joint training program was operating inside these walls. And that understanding made the air feel different, heavier, charged in a way that had nothing to do with the weather outside. Ryan Mitchell had slept 3 hours. I was standing in the formation at 0628 when Emily walked out of the interior corridor, and he looked at her, and he had the specific disorienting experience of seeing someone clearly for the first time after having looked at them wrong for long enough that the correct version feels like a surprise. She was in her training uniform, hair back, moving with the same unhurried, self-contained efficiency she brought to everything, and Ryan realized, standing in the gray morning air, that he had never once since Friday night seen her perform anything. Not confidence, not authority, not calm. Every version of herself she had shown him was simply herself operating at her actual level, without modification for his presence or anyone else's. That realization sat in his chest like something cold. Ortega was beside him, not looking at him, but close enough that his presence communicated what it was meant to communicate, which was, "I am here and I am paying attention, and I will tell you the truth when you are ready for it." Emily began the day with something nobody expected. She told the group to sit down on the floor of the main training space. 41 operators cross-legged on cold concrete, and she pulled a chair to the front and sat in it. Backward arms crossed over the back of it, and she said, "Tell me about a time you failed a decision under pressure." Not a physical failure, a decision failure. Somebody go. Silence. 7 seconds of it, which in a room full of elite operators is approximately 7 years. Then Torres, standing at the side of the room, said, "I'll go." And he told a story about a hostage situation 3 years earlier, in which he had chosen the faster of two extraction options, and the faster option had a complication that the slower option would have avoided, and the complication had resulted in a team member spending 11 days in a military hospital. He told it without drama, without softening it, without placing the blame somewhere more comfortable. When he finished, Emily said, "Thank you." Just that. Then Decker raised his hand. Ryan looked at him. Decker told a story about a training rotation 2 years ago in which he had failed to communicate a plan change clearly to a junior ranger, and the junior ranger had executed the old plan and been injured. "I knew I hadn't said it clearly enough in the moment," Decker said. "I told myself afterward that I had, because it was easier." He paused. "It took me 6 months to stop telling myself that." The room was quiet in a different way now. The kind of quiet that comes when people recognize something real. Emily looked around the group. Ryan Mitchell raised his hand. The room held its breath. You could feel it. 40 people trying to look like they weren't watching. Watching. Emily looked at him. Her expression did not change, did not tighten, did not do anything except give him the same clean, clear attention she had given Torres and Decker. "Sergeant Mitchell," she said. Ryan took a breath. "Friday night," he said. The room went absolutely still. He had not planned to say that. He had planned something else, something professional, and carefully contained a training anecdote about a rotation 2 years ago that was real but safe. And then he had opened his mouth and the actual thing had come out instead because he was tired and he had slept 3 hours. And something Torres had said about the 11 days in the hospital was still sitting on him, and Decker's 6 months of telling himself a comfortable lie had landed somewhere that was still vibrating. He looked at Emily. She held his gaze. Steady, no expression of triumph, no surprise, no discomfort, just presence. "I made a decision," Ryan said, "based on an assessment that was wrong. I looked at a situation and I categorized it wrong, and I acted on the wrong categorization." He paused. "The cost of that decision is in a file in the admin building." He stopped talking. The room didn't breathe. Emily said quietly, "What made the categorization wrong?" Ryan was quiet for 4 seconds. "I assessed based on what I wanted the situation to be." "Well," he said, "not what it was." She nodded once. "Thank you," she said, the same way she'd said it to Torres, the same way she'd said it to Decker, exact same weight, no more and no less. And she moved to the next person. Ryan Mitchell sat on the concrete floor and felt something he had never felt in a professional setting in 14 years of military service. He felt small, not in a diminished way, in the way that you feel small when you are standing inside something larger than yourself, and you have only just understood how large it is. Ortega beside him said nothing, but his hand briefly for exactly 1 second pressed against Ryan's shoulder. Then it was gone, and they moved on. The morning exercise was a multi-team tactical problem in a blacked-out interior course. Teams were mixed. Communication was limited to hand signals and touch contact, and the objective required finding a simulated casualty, assessing condition, and extracting across a course with 3 obstacle variations that changed between runs. The first run, Ryan's team made it in 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Acceptable. The second run, Emily ran it as part of a demonstration team. 2 minutes 51 seconds in a blacked-out course, with one hand occupied supporting the simulated casualty on her shoulder for the final 60 meters. After the demonstration, one of the rangers, not Pruitt this time, but a taciturn, quietly competent guy named Garza, who rarely said anything that wasn't directly operational, turned to the man beside him and said in a low, completely matter-of-fact voice, "That woman is not human." It was not an insult. Ryan heard it. He said nothing, but something in him, something that had been clutching at the version of the story where Emily Carter was adequate rather than exceptional, quietly let go. It had been getting harder to hold anyway. The tactical problem ran until 11:30. At 11:45, Emily assembled the group in the main briefing space for a mid-program assessment review. This was where individual and team scores through the first 3 days were shared, patterns identified, and the second week's program adjustments announced. She walked through the scores methodically. No ceremony, names, numbers, observations. When she reached Ryan Mitchell's profile, she said, "Sergeant Mitchell, physical assessment top tier throughout, water operations strong, decision-making under stress bottom quartile on days 1 and 2, day 3, first morning rotation mid-tier. That's a 14-point improvement in 48 hours. She did not explain the 14-point improvement. She did not note what had caused it. She simply stated it as fact and moved on. Ryan sat with those 14 points. He understood what they represented. They represented what happened when a person stops spending cognitive energy on maintaining a false position. That energy went somewhere when you stopped using it for defense. It went into actual performance. He hadn't known before this program how much of his resources he had been spending on being certain he was the most significant person in any given room. He hadn't known because he had never had to measure it. Emily Carter had given him a way to measure it. She hadn't done it for him, she'd just run her program. Lunch was 40 minutes. Ryan ate quickly and spent the remaining 22 minutes sitting outside on a bench with a cup of coffee that he didn't particularly want looking at, nothing thinking hard. At 12:15, his phone buzzed. A message from Freed, his JAG liaison, "Call me when you get a break." He called. Freed answered on the second ring. "I've reviewed the complaint documentation, all of it. All of it. The surveillance footage, the witness accounts, the written report. I need to give you my professional assessment." "Give it," Ryan said. "It's complete," Freed said. "The documentation is Ryan. I've been doing this for 6 years. This is the most thorough formal complaint I have reviewed. Every claim is supported by at least 2 independent pieces of evidence. The surveillance footage is unambiguous. The witness accounts are consistent. And the written report," he paused. "The written report reads like it was written by someone who has done professional documentation under operational conditions and who understands exactly what constitutes a legally sufficient record." Ryan said nothing. "I'm not going to advise you on what the tribunal will decide," Freed continued. "That's not my role. My role is to tell you what you're looking at. And what you're looking at is a record that, if it goes to tribunal unchanged, has a predictable outcome." "What outcome?" Ryan asked. "Demotion, mandatory disciplinary action, formal notation on your permanent record." Freed paused. "Probable end of your advancement track." Ryan sat on the bench in the pale Thursday afternoon sun and heard those words and felt them land one at a time. Demotion, disciplinary action, advancement track. "What are my options?" he said. "You can contest it. The evidence is what it is, but you have the right to present your account. Or you can make a formal acknowledgement before the tribunal, which the board may consider in determining the shape of the consequences." Freed's voice was careful. "I want to be clear that a formal acknowledgement is not a guarantee of reduced consequences. It's simply an additional factor." Ryan was quiet for a long moment. "I'll call you tonight," he said. He hung up. He sat on the bench with the coffee going cold in his hands, and he thought about a career that had been 14 years in the building. He thought about the deployment rotations and the commendations and the men who had followed him and the specific satisfaction of being good at something difficult and meaningful. He thought about who he had been on Friday night versus who he had been 4 minutes ago on the phone with Freed, and the distance between those two versions felt in this moment enormous. I went back inside. The afternoon session was the one Emily had labeled Advanced Leadership Integration in the program schedule, and it was the one that Torres had warned his Navy personnel about specifically because it was the component Emily had designed herself from scratch, and that had no equivalent in any standard joint training format he had seen. It started simply enough. 2 teams, a complex shared objective, time pressure, Emily watching from the observation level. 40 minutes and everything changed. Emily's voice came through the overhead speakers the first time she had used the PA system during an exercise rather than being physically present. "Objective update," she said. "Team Alpha's primary extraction route is compromised. Team Bravo is now the support element. Alpha Lead, you have 60 seconds to establish new communication protocol with Bravo Lead and adjust your route." Ryan was Alpha Lead. He had 60 seconds. He grabbed the radio and called Bravo's lead, a Navy lieutenant commander named Park, who was efficient and fast and who had been running alongside Ryan's team without friction, which was a thing Ryan had noticed and appreciated without being able to fully articulate why until this week. "Park," Ryan said. "New protocol. I'm going east through the secondary corridor, but I need your team staged at the junction point, not the extraction point. Can you make that?" Park's response came immediately. "We can make that. 43 seconds. What do you need from me?" That was the question. That exact phrasing. What do you need from me? Not "here's what I'm going to do," not "here's the plan." What do you need? Park was quiet for a half second. Then, "I need you to hold at the junction for 7 seconds ere we stage. Give me that window and I can guarantee a clean extraction." "You have it," Ryan said. 7 seconds, confirmed. They executed. Alpha team came through the secondary quarter at full speed, hit the junction point, and Ryan stopped his team for exactly 7 seconds. The longest 7 seconds of the exercise, while Park's team staged perfectly, and then the combined element moved through the final segment and hit the extraction point at a time that, when Emily reported it from the observation level, was the fastest combined result of any team rotation in the 3-day program. The room responded, not with cheering. This was not a cheering crowd, but with the specific quality silence of people who have witnessed something done well. Ryan stood at the extraction point, breathing hard, and Park came up beside him and said, "Good call on the junction hold." "Good call on the 7 seconds, Ryan said. Park nodded, clean, professional, no ceremony. From the observation level, Emily made a note. She wrote, "Mitchell Day 3 afternoon. Adaptive communication under time pressure. Collaborative protocol. Result program, best combined time. Cross-reference against day 1 rotation failure. Trajectory significant." She underlined significant. Then she closed her notebook. At 1800, the 3rd day ended. Ryan was walking toward the exit when Emily's voice caught him. "Sergeant Mitchell." He stopped, turned. She was standing 10 feet away, program notebook under one arm, keys in her other hand. Around them, the facility was emptying out, voices and footsteps moving toward the exits. Equipment being racked, the ordinary sounds of a day ending. She was looking at him directly, the way she always looked at anything, clean and complete. "Your junction call today," she said. "Walk me through your decision." I was surprised. He wasn't sure what he'd expected. He had been anticipating the moment she acknowledged Friday night in a professional context, had been bracing for it since Sunday evening, had constructed several responses to several possible versions of it. He had not constructed a response to her asking him about a training decision. "I had 60 seconds and 2 options," he said, adjusting quickly. "Aggressive route with a lower probability of clean extraction, or the secondary with a 7-second hold that gave Park's team a staging window. The math on the second option was better." "What changed between that decision and your day 1 rotation failure?" He looked at her. She waited. "Day 1, he said. "I wasn't doing the math, I was performing the math." He paused. "I was making it look like I was calculating when I was actually just executing the thing I had already decided before the information was in." She was quiet for a moment. "That's an accurate description of the failure mode," she said. "And it's not uncommon in operators with your profile. High physical confidence creates a cognitive shortcut. The body is so reliable that the mind starts assuming it can operate the same way, fast, decisive, without recalculation." She paused. "The problem is that physical situations and leadership decisions are different systems. One rewards speed, the other rewards revision." Ryan listened to that. "I know," he said. "I'm starting to understand that." Emily looked at him for a moment longer. Then she said, "Good work today." Same tone she'd use with anyone. Precise, unadorned. She walked toward the exit. Ryan stood where she had left him for 3 seconds longer than he needed to. Then he walked out too. That night at 2100 hours, Ryan Mitchell called his commanding officer. Colonel David Harris picked up on the 3rd ring, which meant he had been expecting the call, which meant Freed had already briefed him, which Ryan had anticipated. "Colonel," Ryan said. "Mitchell." Harris's voice was the voice of a man who had known Ryan for 8 years and who was currently experiencing the specific sorrow of watching someone you respect make consequences for themselves that you cannot prevent. "How are you doing?" "I'm clear," Ryan said. "I want to make a formal acknowledgement before the tribunal." Silence. "You understand what that means," Harris said. "Yes, sir. It doesn't guarantee." "I know. Freed told me. I'm not doing it for the guarantee." Ryan paused. "I'm doing it because it's the right thing to do, and I'm done making decisions based on what I want the situation to be instead of what it actually is." Harris was quiet for a long moment. "Who told you that?" he said. Ryan almost laughed. "The program coordinator." "Carter." "Yes, sir." Harris made a sound, not quite a sigh. Something between a sigh and an acknowledgement. "She's exceptional, Ryan. She has been for years. If you'd known her record before Friday, it wouldn't have mattered," Ryan said. And he meant it, which was the hardest part. It wouldn't have mattered because the problem wasn't her record. The problem was me. Harris was silent for a beat. "I'll file the formal acknowledgement paperwork," Harris said. "You'll need to sign it by 0800 tomorrow. I'll be there at 7, Ryan said. He hung up. He sat in his quarters in the dark, and he did not feel better. He had not expected to feel better. The acknowledgement was not a lever that produced relief. It was a step towards something, and it was the right step, and right steps sometimes felt like falling, and sometimes felt like landing, and sometimes felt like both at once. This one felt like both. Friday arrived with a quality of inevitability that the first 3 days had been building toward, though nobody in the facility would have been able to predict exactly what form that inevitability would take. At 700, Ryan Mitchell signed the formal acknowledgement document in Harris's temporary office, read it once, and signed it without asking for changes. It was a clean, specific document. It stated what had happened. It did not minimize. It did not provide context that served as explanation. It simply said, "This is what I did." The signature at the bottom was his name in his own handwriting, and he wrote it with the pen Harris handed him, and he put the pen back down and he sat back and said, "Is that everything?" "That's everything," Harris said. He looked at Ryan for a moment. "This took courage. It took being put in a room where I couldn't maintain the fiction anymore," Ryan said. "I'm not sure that's the same thing as courage." "Maybe it's the beginning of it," Harris said. Ryan had nothing to add to that. He drove to the training facility. He arrived at 0738. Emily was already there. She was standing outside the main entrance, drinking coffee from a travel mug, looking at the sky. When he pulled up, she glanced over. He parked. He got out. He walked toward the entrance, and she didn't turn back to the sky, which meant she was giving him the opportunity to say something if he wanted to. He stopped a few feet from her. "I thought about Friday night in the parking lot of the Anchor." He thought about her sitting in her car for 11 minutes making a decision tree. He thought about 19 pages written before midnight and time-stamped and sent to someone who answered her calls at 9:45 at night because she was a person worth answering for. He thought about 2 minutes and 53 seconds in a blacked-out pool. I thought about what she'd said to Torres and Decker and him on Thursday morning. The same weight in the same 2 words, regardless of rank or history or the file in the admin building that had his name on it. "Thank you. I filed the formal acknowledgement this morning," he said. She looked at him. "With the tribunal," he clarified unnecessarily. "I know what it means," she said. He nodded. "I wanted you to know I did it, not because it changes anything, but because," he stopped, chose the words, "because you ran a real program. For 3 days you have run a real program and you haven't used any of it." He stopped again. "You could have. You had the authority and the justification. And you didn't." Emily was quiet for a moment. "I run programs," she said. "That's what I do. What happened Friday night is in a separate file being managed by separate people through a separate process. Mixing them would have compromised both." She looked at him with the clean, direct gaze that he had finally stopped trying to find a defensive interpretation for. "The program isn't about Friday night. The program is about whether 41 operators come out of 2 weeks better than they went in. That's the job." Ryan stood there. "Why does that distinction matter to you that much?" he asked. It was a genuine question. I wasn't challenging. He was genuinely asking. Emily looked at the sky for a moment. "Because the moment I use this program as a personal instrument, it would stop being a program," she said. "It would become something else. And the people in it, Reyes, Decker Park, all of them, they deserve the real thing. They don't deserve to be in a room where the real thing is happening, but underneath it, something else is operating." She paused. "That's not integrity, that's performance. And I've spent my entire career learning the difference." Ryan Mitchell stood in the early Friday morning air, and he heard those words land in a specific place that he would be thinking about for longer than he could currently estimate. "I understand," he said. "Good," she said. She opened the door to the facility. "Day 4 starts at 0600, she said. "Don't be late." He wasn't late. Day 4 was the most demanding single training day of the program. Emily had structured the second half of the first week to build on the physical and tactical foundation of the first 3 days and move into the psychological components that most joint training programs underemphasize because they were harder to measure and therefore easier to skip. The morning involved a sustained decision-making exercise that ran for 4 hours without break, in which teams were fed new information at irregular intervals and required to continuously update their operational picture without anchoring on initial assessments. The afternoon involved what Emily called the mirror exercise, which was the component that Torres had been most curious about when she designed it, and most certain watching it run that she had gotten exactly right. It worked like this. Each participant was given a written description of a leadership decision they had made during the week, anonymized but accurate. They were then given the description of that same decision written from the perspective of the person most affected by it. Not an accusation, just a perspective. And they were asked to read both and then write one paragraph responding to the gap between the two. Ryan Mitchell's description was the day one rotation failure. The perspective provided was Reyes's account, the one Emily had written down after their conversation on Monday afternoon. What it felt like to receive an instruction, ask for clarification, be bypassed, and feel invisible in a team environment that was supposed to rely on every member. He read his own decision first. Then he read Reyes' perspective. He sat with it for 6 minutes. The exercise allowed 10. Then he wrote his paragraph. When Emily collected them at the end of the exercise, she read them all that evening in her office. Most were thoughtful. Several were genuinely insightful. Some were still defended, still partially behind the glass of professional language, not quite letting the real thing through. Ryan Mitchell's was 4 sentences long. He had written, "I understood what I was doing when I did it. I told myself it was efficiency. It wasn't efficiency. It was the fear that asking for clarity would reveal that I didn't have all of it, and that fear cost someone else their place in a situation where they had earned it." Emily read it twice. She put it in his file. She made a note that said simply arrived. Friday evening, the program group had their first informal gathering, a tradition Emily maintained because she had found over 2 years of running programs that what happened in the unstructured hours between formal sessions was often where the most significant integration occurred. People talked to each other differently when they weren't being assessed. Walls that were still up in professional context came down. Connections formed that changed how teams operated for the following week. Ryan Mitchell arrived at the gathering and found himself sitting next to Reyes. She looked at him, he looked at her. "I owe you an apology," he said. Reyes' expression shifted. She hadn't expected directness. She had been prepared for avoidance the way junior service members always prepare for the thing that's easier for the senior person. "Day one," he said, "I bypassed you when you asked for clarification. That was a leadership failure and it had a specific cost to you personally. I'm sorry." Reyes was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know if you knew," she said. "I knew," he said. "I told myself something else about it, but I knew." She nodded slowly. "Okay," she said, "then thank you." They sat together for another 20 minutes and talked about the blacked-out course exercise and what it felt like to navigate without vision and how the body adapted when it couldn't rely on what it normally relied on. And it was a real conversation, the kind that happened between two people who were actually in the same room as each other. From across the gathering space, Ortega watched Ryan sitting with Reyes. He watched for a moment. Then he picked up his drink and walked over and sat down on Ryan's other side, and the three of them talked for another 40 minutes. And it was the kind of conversation that none of them would be able to fully describe afterward, but that each of them would remember in the specific textured way that you remember the moments when you first began to understand something important. Saturday morning, the program was halfway done. 9 days remained. 19 days until the tribunal. Emily arrived at the facility at 0515 on Saturday, 2 hours before the day's program began, and she sat in her office with the week one assessment data and built the second week structure on top of it. She adjusted for what the group had shown her. She added 2 components she had been holding in reserve for teams that were ready for them and removed one that was no longer necessary because the group had arrived at its intended learning faster than the standard timeline. She was 2/3 through the scheduling when her phone rang. "Captain Holloway," Emily answered. "We have a development," Holloway said. "The surveillance footage from the bar, the second camera, the one above the front door, the one you noted in your initial report." "Yes," Emily said. "The audio pickup on that camera was active. We didn't flag it initially because we were focused on the visual, but the audio is clear. Everything he said before the strike is captured verbatim." A pause. "Emily, it's significant. The statements he made about women and special operations, the specific language, it changes the character of the incident from assault to assault with discriminatory motivation. The tribunal board will have access to all of it." Emily was quiet for a moment. "Okay," she said. "I wanted you to hear it from me before the formal notification. I appreciate that, Emily said. How are you doing? Holloway asked. It was the second time in 10 days someone had asked Emily that question in a way that meant something beyond its function. I'm running a good program, Emily said. Holloway was quiet for a moment. I've been doing this job for 20 years, she said, and the way you've handled this, the documentation, the formal channels, the separation between the complaint and the professional environment. I want you to know that what you did the night this happened was not normal. Most people don't have that kind of clarity under that kind of pressure. I had good training, Emily said. You had exceptional training, Holloway said, and you are an exceptional person. Emily didn't answer right away. Then she said, will the tribunal board have everything they need? Everything, Holloway said. It's complete. It was complete from the moment you filed it. Emily thanked her and hung up. She sat in her office in the Saturday morning quiet, and she picked up her pen, and she went back to the second week's schedule. She had a program to finish. And more operators who needed her to be exactly who she was doing, exactly what she was there to do, with exactly the same integrity she'd been operating with since the moment she walked out of the anchor and sat in her car in the parking lot and made a decision tree instead of a fist. She finished the schedule at 7:10. She went to get coffee. The second week was about to begin. And the thing that had been set in motion the night Ryan Mitchell raised his hand in a crowded bar was now moving with the quiet, unstoppable momentum of a process that had been documented, completely witnessed fully, and placed in the hands of people who understood exactly what they were holding. Emily Carter had known from the parking lot of the anchor that it would get here. She had just had to be patient enough to let it arrive. Part 4, the weight of what you've built. Saturday, our 7:30 hours, day 8 of the program. The second week started with a different energy than the first. It was impossible to name precisely the facility was the same, the personnel were the same, the schedule was printed on the same paper with the same formatting, but the room felt different because the people in it were different. Not transformed, not finished, but shifted. The way a bone shifts after a fracture begins healing. The shape is almost the same, but the structure underneath has reorganized around the damage and is building something denser where it was weakest. Ryan Mitchell felt it walking in. I had slept 6 hours, which was 2 more than Thursday night and 3 more than Wednesday, and the trajectory of that number was telling him something about what was happening inside him that he didn't have clean language for yet. He sat in the second row. He hadn't gone back to the front, and he wasn't going to, and he watched Emily set up at the front of the briefing room with the same unhurried efficiency she brought every morning, and he thought about 4 sentences he had written the previous afternoon, and he thought about a paragraph Holloway had apparently sent to the tribunal board describing audio from a camera above the front door of a bar, and he sat with all of it without trying to organize it into something manageable. He had stopped trying to make things manageable 3 days ago. That had turned out to be its own kind of progress. Emily opened the second week the way she'd opened the first, directly without ceremony. Second week, and she said, different focus. Last week was about individual capacity and team mechanics. This week is about what happens when both of those things are under pressure simultaneously. Not training pressure, the real thing. She looked around the room. Every exercise this week is designed to create the conditions under which performance degradation is most likely. Sleep restriction, information overload, conflicting authority, resource scarcity. You will fail some of these. The point is not to not fail. The point is to understand what you look like when you fail so you can recognize it in yourself in the field before it costs someone else. She paused. The second thing this week addresses, she said, is what you owe the people who serve alongside you, not in a general way, specifically, by name. This week you will know in measurable terms what your decisions cost your teammates and what theirs cost you. She let that sit for a moment. That's harder than any physical component we ran last week. I want you to know that going in. The room was quiet with the quality of people who believe what they're being told. Move out at 07:45, she said. The first exercise of week 2 was something Emily called the cascade scenario. It ran for 6 hours. It was the longest single continuous exercise in the program, and it was designed so that the decisions made in the first hour created the conditions for the second hour, which created the conditions for the third, so that every choice compounded, and the team was by hour 4 living inside the results of what they had chosen 3 hours earlier without being able to go back and revise. It was Taurus Thaw watching from the observation level, the closest thing to actual operational reality that a training environment could produce. Not because the scenarios were realistic, they were constructed, obviously, but because the weight of accumulated decision-making felt real. The fatigue was real. The moment when you looked at the situation in hour 5 and understood that the narrow path you were on was the direct result of 17 decisions you had made before lunch. That recognition was real and it landed on people the way real things land. Ryan's team performed better in this exercise than in anything from week 1. Not because Ryan performed better individually, his scores were comparable to the week 1 trajectory. But because the team performed better and the difference was Ryan, specifically the way Ryan was operating inside the team. He was communicating earlier before his certainty was complete, which gave the team more time to process and respond. He was asking questions he previously would have answered himself. He was twice explicitly wrong about something and corrected by a team member. And both times he incorporated the correction without resistance and without losing the forward movement of the decision. Park, his teammate from the junction call on Thursday, noticed it specifically. During a brief break at hour 4, Park said, "You're different this week." Ryan drank his water. "Better or worse?" "Better," Park said, significantly. Ryan looked at him. "What was I doing before?" Park considered this. He was the kind of person who considered things before speaking, which Ryan had initially found frustrating and now found clarifying. "You were solving problems that your team was also capable of solving, but faster than they could, so they never got to." He paused. Speed isn't always efficiency. Sometimes speed is just another word for not trusting the people around you. Ryan was quiet with that for a moment. "Watts told me something similar on Wednesday," he said. "Watts is very smart," Park said. "Yeah," Ryan said. "I'm starting to understand that about a lot of people I underestimated." Park didn't respond to that directly. Instead, he said, "The junction call on Thursday, where did that come from?" "I asked what you needed," Ryan said, "and you told me, and I trusted it. That's all it was." "That's all it was." Ryan paused. "I've been doing this for 14 years, and that was apparently a new behavior for me." Park looked at him for a moment with an expression that wasn't pity and wasn't judgment. It was something closer to the kind of recognition that one professional has for another when they identify a hard truth being acknowledged honestly. "Well," Park said, "at least you figured it out." They went back to the exercise. At 400 hours, the cascade scenario ended. The debrief ran for 90 minutes. Emily walked the group through the compounding decision chain, showing them on a whiteboard how the hour 1 decisions had created the hour 4 conditions. It was one of the most instructive 90 minutes any of them had experienced in a professional training context, not because the information was new, but because seeing your own decision architecture laid out in a linear chain, consequence by consequence, is a different experience from knowing abstractly that decisions have consequences. Ryan sat through the debrief and watched his hour 1 choices produce his hour 4 reality and felt something that was very close to what he had felt reading Reyes's perspective in the mirror exercise. Not shame, something more structural. The precise, uncomfortable understanding of mechanism, of how he worked, of what produced what. At 1600, Emily pulled him aside, not in the way that had a charge to it, not in the way of someone with authority using a private moment to deliver a verdict, just practically. She had a program note to discuss, and he was the relevant person. "Your team's cascade result," she said, "second best in the combined group. I want to use your hour 1 decision sequence as a case study in tomorrow's debrief. Anonymous. Just the decision structure, not the names." She paused. "I want your permission." He looked at her. "You don't need my permission." "For the anonymous case study, no," she said, "but it's your decision architecture. You should know it's being used." He nodded slowly. "Go ahead. Use it." "Thank you," she said. He almost said something else. He started to format something about Friday night, or the formal acknowledgement, or the audio footage from the camera above the door. But she was already turning back to her notes, already onto the next thing. And he understood, in the way he was slowly beginning to understand most things about Emily Carter, that this was not avoidance. She was simply doing what she always did, moving through the work with complete focus, one thing at a time, nothing bleeding into anything it wasn't supposed to touch. I went back to his team. Sunday was a rest day, half rest, which in military training terms meant a reduced schedule rather than no schedule, with a morning brief and afternoon individual study and the evenings free. Ryan spent Sunday morning writing a letter he had not planned to write. He sat at the narrow desk in his temporary quarters with a legal pad and a pen. He was a man who thought better on paper, a habit he'd developed in his 20s and never explained to anyone because it seemed like the kind of thing that didn't need explaining if you understood it and couldn't be explained if you didn't, and he started writing. He wasn't writing to the tribunal. He wasn't writing to Colonel Harris. He wasn't writing to his JAG liaison. He was writing to Emily Carter. Not a formal document, not an apology for the record, a letter in the original sense of the word, a person writing to another person about what was real. He wrote for 2 hours. He filled 11 pages. At the end, he read what he had written. He put the legal pad in the drawer of the desk. I wasn't going to send it. He knew that before he started writing it. The letter wasn't for sending. It was for the same reason that people say things out loud when they're alone, because saying them even without an audience makes them real in a way they aren't when they only exist inside you. What he had written was a complete accounting of the version of himself that had walked into the Anchor on Friday night 3 weeks ago. Where that version had come from, what it had believed about itself, what it had been protecting, why the protection had felt necessary, and what it had cost not just on Friday night, but over years, over a career, over a life spent being the person at the center of things who couldn't tolerate the possibility that the center might shift. He had written it all down. He closed the drawer. He went to the commissary and ate lunch and sat with Decker and Ortega, and they talked about the Cascade scenario in the second week schedule, in a bar 2 miles up the road that Ortega had heard made good food, and it was an ordinary conversation among people who had known each other long enough that ordinary conversations were possible, even inside extraordinary circumstances. At one point, Decker said, "The tribunal is next week." "Thursday," Ryan said. Decker looked at him. "How are you feeling about it?" "Honestly," Ryan said. "Yeah. I filed the acknowledgement. I told the truth in it. Whatever comes from that, it comes." He paused. "I'm not trying to manage the outcome anymore. I'm done managing outcomes I built by making the wrong call in the first place." Ortega, who had been eating quietly and listening with the particular attention of someone who has been through enough to know when something real is being said, set down his fork and looked at Ryan directly. "That right there," Ortega said, "is the most you've sounded like yourself in 14 years. Ryan looked at him. "What does that mean?" "It means," Ortega said carefully, "that the person I just heard is the reason I followed you into rotations that scared me. That's the version of you that was worth following." He paused. "The other version, the one on Friday night, that one I didn't recognize." The table was quiet for a moment. "Me neither," Ryan said. "Not anymore." Monday, 0600 hours, day 10, 4 days until the tribunal. The second week's pace had accelerated. Emily had designed it this way. Deliberately, week 1 builds the foundation. Week 2 tests whether the foundation holds under load. The load on Monday was a 22-hour continuous operation exercise split across 2 shifts in which teams rotated through command roles in real time while the overall mission continued without pause. This was the exercise that broke people who hadn't done the internal work. Not physically. The physical demands were significant but manageable for this group's baseline. What broke people was the sustained pressure of responsibility, being in command when you're tired, when the information is incomplete, when the team is also tired, and when the cost of a poor decision isn't hypothetical, but is visible immediately in the performance of the shift that follows yours. Ryan took the 0-200 shift, the worst shift by conventional wisdom, the one where the circadian rhythm is at its lowest, where judgment is most compromised, where the temptation to anchor on your most recent decision rather than reassessing is highest. He had requested that shift specifically. When Torres, who was managing the rotation schedule, raised an eyebrow, Ryan said, "I want the hardest one." Torres wrote him in. 8-0200, Ryan took command from a Navy lieutenant who handed off with a situation brief and a set of ongoing decision threads that needed management. Ryan listened to all of it. He asked 3 clarifying questions. He waited until he understood the complete picture before he changed anything. The shift ran 4 hours. 8-0600. When Ryan handed it off to the next commander, the situation had advanced significantly. 2 of the decision threads had been resolved. 1 had been escalated appropriately. The team coming on was inheriting a cleaner operational picture than Ryan had received. The commander taking over a young Navy SEAL ensign named Washington, who was 24 years old and whose talent was visible in everything he did, looked at the situation brief Ryan handed him and said, "This is clean." "It should be," Ryan said. "You're going to do good work with it." Washington looked at him. "How do you know?" "Because I watched you run the Cascade scenario," Ryan said. "You read situations fast, and you trust your team. Don't stop doing that." Washington nodded, something in his expression. A young operator receiving specific professional recognition from a senior one that was a real thing. It cost nothing to give, and it was worth something to receive, and Ryan had understood that theoretically for years and was only now beginning to do it in practice. He went to get coffee. At 06 from time, Emily was walking the facility reviewing overnight notes. She passed Ryan at the coffee station. "How was the O2 shift?" she said. "Hard," he said. "Good." She looked at the notes Torres had marked for the overnight rotation. She read the 0200 0600 entry. She made a note of her own. "You requested that shift," she said. It wasn't a question. "I wanted the one I couldn't coast through," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Why have I?" He held his coffee. "Because coasting is how I got to Friday night. A long time of taking the route that confirmed what I already believed about myself. I want to stop doing that." Emily looked at him with an expression that was not warmth, exactly not the performed warmth of someone managing another person's feelings, but something realer. The expression of one professional recognizing another professional doing something genuinely difficult with genuine commitment. "That's a significant shift," she said. "I know," he said. She went back to her notes. He drank his coffee, and then at 0700 Monday morning, the thing happened that nobody had prepared for. Ryan was in the main training corridor, walking toward the briefing room, when he heard raised voices from the secondary equipment bay, a room used for gear storage and maintenance normally empty during program hours. He recognized one of the voices. It was Pruitt, the young ranger, 23 years old, the one who had said "holy something" when Emily set the pool record. His voice had the specific strained quality of someone who was angry and was also frightened, which was a combination Ryan had learned to identify in the years when his ability to read rooms had been operational rather than self-serving. The second voice was a Navy petty officer named Callahan 31, who had been on the fringes of Ryan's awareness all week as someone with a performance chip on his shoulder that manifested as low-grade antagonism toward anyone he perceived as positioned above him. Ryan stopped outside the bay. He heard Callahan say, "You want to tell me again how your team's Cascade result was better, because from where I was standing, your lead made 3 calls in hour 2 that my team had to compensate for." Pruitt's voice. "That's not what happened." "That's exactly what happened. And the only reason your numbers look good on paper is because Lieutenant Carter's scoring weights leadership adaptation, which your sergeant got credit for because he spent a week figuring out what the rest of us already knew." "That's not fair," Pruitt said. His voice was getting tighter. "That's not what she measured. I'm just saying your team's result came off ours. You should know that." Ryan walked into the bay. Both of them looked up. Callahan's expression shifted the micro-adjustment of someone recalibrating for an unexpected audience. Ryan looked at Callahan. "Say the last thing you said again," Ryan said. Callahan was quiet for a moment. "I was just pointing out." "I heard what you were pointing out," Ryan said. His voice was level, not heated, just clear. "The way a river is clear when there's nothing in it that shouldn't be there. Let me respond to it. My team's Cascade result was their result. Every decision they made in that exercise they made. I was part of that team. If you have a specific objection to how the scoring weighted a particular metric, you take it to the program coordinator. Through official channels, in writing." He paused. "What you don't do is take it to a 23-year-old in a gear bay." Callahan looked at him. Something in the look was calculating, trying to determine what it cost to push back and what it cost to concede. "Roger that," Callahan said. "Good," Ryan said. "We're done here." Callahan picked up the equipment he'd been retrieving and left. Pruitt stood there. He looked at Ryan with an expression that was complicated in the way that young people's expressions are complicated when someone they have reason to distrust does something that makes distrust difficult. Ryan looked at him. "You okay?" "Yes, sir," Pruitt said. "You sure?" Pruitt hesitated. Then, "Sergeant Mitchell, can I ask you something?" Ryan waited. Why did you come in? You didn't have to." Ryan was quiet for a moment. "Because he was wrong," Ryan said. And you were in a room with someone who was wrong and it was getting louder and smaller in there. He paused. I know what that feels like. Being in a room that's getting smaller and louder. I've been in that room, he paused again. I've also been the person making it smaller and louder. And I'm not doing that anymore. Pruitt looked at him for a long moment. The bar, Pruitt said quietly. Yeah, Ryan said. You know, we all knew, right, the whole table. We all knew what you did was wrong. I know, Ryan said. Decker almost said something. I know he did, Ryan said. He told me. Pruitt looked at the floor. I didn't say anything. You were 23 years old at a table with your sergeant, Ryan said. The calculus on that is complicated. I understand why you didn't say anything. I should have, Pruitt said. Yeah, Ryan said. But now you know. And next time you'll have this moment to draw on. He picked up the equipment near the door that he'd originally come in to retrieve. That's how it works. You accumulate the moments where you didn't do the right thing, and they become the reason you do it next time. He walked out. Pruitt stood in the empty equipment bay and thought about that for 3 minutes before he went back to the briefing room. Tuesday and Wednesday ran hard and fast the way the final days of a demanding program run when the group has found its rhythm and the work is happening the way it was designed to. Emily ran both days with the same focused precision as every previous day, but there was a quality to Tuesday and Wednesday that was different from the first week. The group was no longer performing competence for the assessment. They were operating it. The distinction was visible, measurable, and exactly what Emily had designed the program to produce. On Tuesday afternoon, Torres told her that in 9 years of running joint programs, this was the highest performing combined group he'd seen in a second week. What's producing it? He asked. Emily thought for a moment. They had a real conversation on day 3, she said. The circle session. Once a room tells the truth about failure, the energy that was going into maintaining the performance of competence gets freed up. Get the real version of people. She paused. The real version is almost always better than the performance. Mitchell opened that, Torres said. He was the first one to say something that cost him something. Emily said. Yes. Torres was quiet for a moment. How are you holding all of this, the program, and the separately, Emily said. The same way I've held it from the beginning. Torres nodded. He'd expected that answer. He also knew that holding two significant things separately with full entirety in both was not an easy thing regardless of how cleanly you stated the principle. You know what I think, Torres said. I think you're going to look back on this program as one of the best things you ran. Not despite everything else. Because of how you ran it despite everything else. Emily looked at him. Let's see how Thursday goes first, she said. Thursday is 0800 hours, the tribunal. The tribunal board convened in a formal hearing room in the administrative building 2 blocks from the training facility. 5 members. Colonel Harris presiding over the Army side. A Navy commander named Ellison presiding over the joint interests. Captain Holloway presenting the investigative findings, Ryan's JAG liaison Freed at his side. Emily seated opposite her own legal representative, a lieutenant commander named Vasquez, who had reviewed every page of documentation and had told Emily on Wednesday night that she had built the most airtight record of a service-related assault complaint she had seen in 11 years. Emily was in dress uniform. Ryan was in dress uniform. They had not spoken since Monday morning's coffee exchange. They had been in the same building for 4 days. They had occupied the same professional space. They had not spoken not because of avoidance, but because there was nothing in the program that required it, and both of them understood implicitly that what happened Thursday happened in a different room with different rules. The proceedings opened at 0800. Holloway presented the investigative findings in sequence. The initial complaint, the documentation, the surveillance footage, both cameras, including the audio from the second, the 7 witness statements, Ryan's formal acknowledgement. When the audio from the second camera played in the hearing room, it was the first time Emily had heard it outside of Holloway's brief description. Hearing it in this room formal, and still every word captured cleanly what he had said about women in special operations, the word minor in a tone she hadn't expected the specific language that the board would weigh, in their determination. Emily sat with it and kept her face composed and breathed evenly and thought about 11 pages of a legal pad in a desk drawer and a man who had taken the Lotto 200 shift because he wanted the hardest one. She held those two things, the audio and the letter she hadn't read, but knew existed in some form because She understood what honest reckoning looked like in a person, and she had been watching it happen in Ryan Mitchell for 9 days. She held them separately, the same way she held everything. The board asked Emily 4 questions. She answered each one with the same precision and completeness she had brought to every documentation task since the night it happened. No embellishment, no performance. Just the truth stated clearly with the evidence to support it. The board asked Ryan 5 questions. Oh, the 5th question, do you have anything to add to your formal acknowledgement? Ryan said, I want to say on the record that the formal acknowledgement I filed reflects the complete truth of what happened. Not a minimized version, not a strategic version. The complete truth. What I did on Friday the 18th was indefensible, and I have not attempted to defend it. I've spent the last 9 days in the same professional environment as Lieutenant Carter, and I want the board to know that her conduct throughout that time has been the clearest possible demonstration of what professional integrity actually looks like. Not what it's supposed to look like, what it actually looks like. He paused. I don't expect that to change the board's determination. I'm saying it because it's true and because the record should contain the truth. The room was quiet. Colonel Harris looked at Ryan for a moment. Emily looked at the table in front of her. The board recessed at 10:15. They returned at 11:20. The determination was delivered in the formal language that military proceedings use, which strips the human weight from the words even as it carries it. Sergeant First Class Ryan Mitchell, in the matter of the complaint, filed October 18th by Lieutenant Emily J. Carter. The board finds the complaint substantiated in full. The board further finds that the nature of the conduct, including both the physical assault and the documented discriminatory statements, constitutes a serious breach of the standards of conduct expected of a United States Army Ranger at all times and in all settings. The board's determination is as follows: reduction in grade from Sergeant First Class to Staff Sergeant, effective immediately. Mandatory completion of the formal leadership and conduct remediation program. Formal notation in the permanent service record. Suspension of advancement consideration for a period of not less than 18 months. Ryan Mitchell sat in his chair and heard every word and did not flinch and did not look away from the board. When the determination concluded, he said, I understand and accept the board's determination. Nothing else. Emily said nothing. The proceedings concluded at 11:35. In the hallway outside the hearing room, Emily's legal representative, Vasquez, put a hand on her arm briefly and said, You handled that with remarkable composure. Thank you, Emily said. How are you feeling? Emily thought about it. Done, she said, not in a hollow way. In the way of someone who has carried something significant through a long distance and has arrived at the place they were carrying it to. I feel done, Vasquez nodded. Go run your last day of the program, she said. That's where you belong. Emily walked back to the training facility. She arrived at 11:55. She had 4 hours left of the 2-week program. She was going to use all of them. In the parking lot, she paused for 30 seconds. She looked at the gray building in front of her. She thought about 19 pages written before midnight. She thought about an audio file from a camera above a door. She thought about what Holloway had said, the way you've handled this was not normal. She thought about what she had said to her sister, I'm okay. She thought about page 247 of a book about a woman climbing a mountain alone, and how the woman in the book had said somewhere around page 280 that the mountain didn't care about her reasons for climbing it. It only measured whether she was still moving. Emily Carter was still moving. She went inside. She ran the last 4 hours of the program with the same completeness, the same focus, the same unmodified professional standard she had brought to every hour of the previous 9 days. She did not tell the group what had happened at the tribunal. It was not their information. The program was not about the tribunal. It had never been about the tribunal. At 1600 hours, the program formally concluded. She stood at the front of the briefing room and looked at 41 operators who were measurably better than they had been 2 weeks ago. And she said, you did good work, every one of you. Take what you learned here and use it. That's the only metric that matters after today. She looked around the room one final time. Dismissed, she said. The room broke into the sound of a group released chairs, moving voices, starting the particular human noise of people who have been through something together and are now processing what it was. Ryan Mitchell stood up. He looked at Emily across the room. She was already talking to Torres program notebooks being collected, the administrative closeout of the session underway. He didn't approach. He didn't need to. What had happened in that room over the past 2 weeks was its own complete thing, separate from the tribunal, separate from Friday night, a real and finished thing that stood on its own. He picked on his gear. He walked toward the exit. At the door, Decker fell into step beside him. "How did it go?" Decker said. "This morning." "The way it should have," Ryan said. Decker was quiet for a step. "Are you okay?" Ryan thought about 11 pages in a desk drawer, about a 24-year-old handing off a clean operational picture at Euro 600, about Pruitt in a gear bay, on about 7 seconds at a junction point, about a woman setting a pool record without trying, and the specific quality of the silence that had followed. "I'm getting there," he said. They walked out together into the afternoon. Part 5, what remains after everything else is gone. 3 weeks after the program ended, the base felt different to Emily Carter. Not physically, not in any way she could point to and explain to someone who hadn't been there through all of it, but in the way that places feel different when you have lived something significant inside them, when the walls have absorbed something that changes how you move through the space, even though the walls themselves haven't changed at all. She was at her desk at 0715 on a Tuesday morning, working through the program assessment report that was due to Naval Command by end of week. It was substantial work. 41 individual performance profiles team, dynamic analyses, program effectiveness, metrics, and a recommendations section that she had been thinking about since the mirror exercise on day 4. The recommendations section was the part she cared most about and had spent the most time on because it was the part that would determine whether what happened in that facility over 2 weeks stayed inside that facility or moved outward into the institution. She wanted it to move outward. Her phone buzzed at 0722. A message from Torres Naval Command responded to your preliminary findings. Admiral Chen wants a briefing, Thursday 1400. Emily read it. She set the phone down. She kept writing. Admiral Patricia Chen was the kind of senior officer whose reputation preceded her in the specific way that reputations precede people who have done enough real things that the stories can't be exaggerated into fiction because the truth is already more than sufficient. She was 56 years old, had 3 decades of naval service, had commanded 2 fleet operations, and chaired the panel that produced the most significant revision to joint training standards in a generation. She had been reading Emily's preliminary assessment report since Sunday. Emily had known the briefing was coming. She had not known it would be Thursday. She had expected to have another week. She had everything she needed for Thursday. She'd had it since Sunday. She kept writing. At 0900, her door opened and Reyes knocked on the frame. Emily looked up. Reyes was in uniform, her posture carrying a different quality than the first day of the program, straighter. Not in a rigid way, but in the way of someone who has added something to their internal structure, something load-bearing. Lieutenant Carter, Reyes said, "Do you have a few minutes?" "Come in," Emily said. Reyes sat in the chair across from the desk. She had a folder in her hands that she held with the careful attention of something she'd prepared specifically. "I wanted to talk to you about something," Reyes said, "before you submitted the final assessment report." "Okay," Emily said. "The mirror exercise," Reyes said. "Day 4, I know you used my account, anonymously, as the perspective piece for Sergeant Mitchell's case study." Emily looked at her. "How do you know that?" "He told me," Reyes said, "on Friday the last day. He came and apologized, and he told me that what I'd described being bypassed, feeling invisible, he'd had to read it and respond to it in writing. He wanted me to know it had been seen, that it was in the record." She paused. "He didn't have to tell me that." "No," Emily said, "he didn't." Reyes was quiet for a moment. "I wanted to say something about the program, about what you did." She opened the folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper handwritten. "I wrote it out because I didn't trust myself to say it clearly out loud." Emily looked at her. "You can read it or you can just tell me." Reyes thought about that for a second. Then she put the folder down. "When I came into this program," she said, "I had already decided that I was going to keep my head down and not make any noise and get through it without becoming a problem for anyone. Because that's what I learned to do in every environment I've been in since I joined it. That's been the strategy. Don't be visible. Don't give anyone a reason to make you smaller than they were already going to make you." She paused. "And then I watched you run 2 weeks of a program in which something very specific was happening to you personally. Something I only understood fully when the assessment notes came through and you ran it exactly the same as if it wasn't happening at all. Emily said nothing. I watched you see me, Reyes said. On day one, I watched you notice that I was shaken and ask me a direct question and actually wait for the real answer. And I thought that's what it looks like when someone isn't performing care. That's the actual thing. Her voice was steady, but something underneath it was working hard to stay steady. I don't want to keep my head down anymore. I want to be visible. I want to be what I actually am in every room I walk into and not apologize for it. She paused. You showed me what that looks like. That's what I wanted to say. Emily looked at Reyes for a moment. She thought about things she could say. Several of them were the kind of true things that people in positions of experience say to people in positions of becoming, and they were meaningful and they were real, but they were also in some fundamental way beside the point. So instead, she said, what is your next assignment? Reyes blinked. I'm in review for the advanced operator assessment. 2 months. Are you ready? I think so, Reyes said. And then more honestly, I will be. Come back and tell me how it goes, Emily said. Reyes looked at her for a moment with an expression that contained several things at once, gratitude and something that was almost but not quite surprise, the surprise of someone who has expected less and received more and is still calibrating to that. Yes, ma'am, she said. She stood. She picked up her folder. She walked to the door. Lieutenant Carter, she said, hand on the frame. Emily looked up. The pool record, Reyes said, 2 minutes of 53. I looked up the previous record. It had stood for 6 years. I know, Emily said. Did you know you were going to break it? Emily picked up her pen. I wasn't thinking about the record, she said. I was thinking about the course. Reyes nodded like someone receiving a piece of information that confirmed something they had already suspected. Then she was gone. Emily sat alone in her office with the pen in her hand, and she thought about what Reyes had said, not the record part, not the pool, but the part about keeping her head down, about deciding in advance to be smaller than she was in order to avoid giving someone else the opportunity to do it for her. She thought about how many people inside this institution were operating on that logic right now. How much of what those people had to offer was being compressed into a shape that fits someone else's comfort zone. She thought about the recommendations section of her report. She picked up her pen and kept writing. Thursday, 1400 hours, Naval Command Headquarters. Admiral Chen's office was on the 4th floor of a building that had been used for senior naval operations for 32 years, and it had the specific quality of spaces where significant decisions have been made consistently enough that the room seems to carry the weight of them, not in a grand way, but in the way that a good tool develops a patina that tells you something about how seriously it has been used. Emily came in at 13:55 and was seated by 13:58. Admiral Chen came in at exactly 1400, which told you something about her that nothing else needed to confirm. She was a compact, direct woman with gray at her temples and the eyes of someone who had learned to read situations faster than most people could describe them. She sat down, opened the folder containing Emily's preliminary findings, and said without preamble, "Tell me what I'm looking at." Emily told her, "Not the summary version, the real version. The program design, the assessment architecture, the week 1 to week 2 performance trajectories, the cascade scenario, results, the mirror exercise, outcomes." She talked about what she had found when she put Army and Navy operators in a room together and gave them real problems in the space to be honest about failure. She talked about what happened to performance levels when the energy that had been going into professional performance was redirected into actual professional execution. She talked about Reyes. She talked about the junction call. She talked about the cascade scenario and what it demonstrated about decision architecture and compounding consequences. Admiral Chen listened. She made notes. She asked 5 questions, each one going one level deeper than the previous. At the end, she set her pen down. The recommendations section, she said, "Walk me through it." Emily walked her through it. Mandatory mirrors, exercise integration across all joint training programs. Structured failure debriefs as a standard component rather than an optional add-on. Mixed unit leadership rotations with weighted assessment for collaborative decision-making. A formal mentorship pipeline for women in advanced operator tracks with assigned senior operators who had completed the full program. and a harassment reporting architecture that combined immediate documentation support, formal investigative timelines, and mandatory bystander intervention protocols installed at the unit level before incidents occurred. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Admiral Chen looked at the recommendations section in the folder. The last item, she said, the reporting architecture. This comes from personal experience. It was not a question. Yes, Emily said. Admiral Chen looked at her directly. I read the tribunal report. Emily held her gaze. I assumed you had. What you built, the documentation, the channels, the separation between the formal process and the professional environment, that's exactly what the system is supposed to produce, but almost never does. Because most people in your position at that moment make a different choice. She paused. Why didn't you? Emily thought about that for a moment. Not because she didn't know the answer, because she wanted to give Admiral Chen the real answer rather than the clean one. Because revenge is fast and justice is slow, Emily said. And fast felt wrong. The moment I walked out of that bar and sat in my car, I understood that if I wanted something that would last, something that would change the situation rather than just respond to it, I had to be willing to be patient. I had to trust the process more than I trusted my own anger. She paused. My anger was real. It still is. But I've been trained to distinguish between information and instruction. My anger was information. It wasn't my instructions. Admiral Chen was quiet for a full 5 seconds. Then she picked up her pen. I'm approving the full recommendations package, she said. I want a pilot program at 3 installations by the first quarter. I want your assessment report formatted as an institutional guidance document. And I want you to present the mirror exercise and the Cascade Scenario Framework at the Joint Leadership Symposium in February. Emily absorbed this. I'll have the formatting complete by end of month, she said. Good. Admiral Chen closed the folder. Then she opened it again and looked at one specific page. The pool record, she said, 2 minutes 53. That's been in your program notes since day 3. Torres noted it, Emily said. 2 minutes 53, Admiral Chen said again, as if she were weighing the number itself. You weren't trying for the record. I was running the course, Emily said. Admiral Chen looked at her with the expression of someone who has spent 30 years in a profession and still occasionally encounters a person who reminds them why the profession matters. Lieutenant Carter, she said, keep running the course. Emily drove back to the base in the late Thursday afternoon light, and she thought about February and the symposium and 3 pilot installations in a recommendations package that would carry her name into institutional policy that would outlast any specific incident or assignment or moment in a bar on a Friday night. She thought about what outlasting means, not victory in a contest, persistence in a direction, the difference between winning and continuing. She went home. She made dinner. She called her sister, who was 3 weeks from the wedding, and wanted to know about final dress fittings. I'll be there, Emily said. Promise, promise. You always say you'll be there and then something classified happens. I know, Emily said, but the tribunal is done and the program is done and the report is almost done and nothing classified is happening in the next 3 weeks. The tribunal, her sister said. Is that over? Are you okay? It's over, Emily said. I'm okay. For real this time? Not okay means something is happening okay. Emily was quiet for a moment. For real, she said. Something happened. It went through the process worked. And now I'm thinking about February and a symposium and you in a wedding dress, and all of it feels, she paused. It feels right. The weight of it is the right kind. Her sister was quiet for a beat. I love you, she said. I love you too, Emily said. She finished dinner. She opened her novel, page 312. The woman on K2 had made the summit. She was on the descent now, which the woman in the book described as the hardest part. Not because it was technically more difficult, but because the summit was behind her, and the human tendency was to relax exactly when relaxation was most dangerous. Emily read until 10. She turned off the light. She slept 7 hours. 6 weeks after the tribunal, on a gray November morning, Ryan Mitchell knocked on the door of Emily Carter's office. She looked up, but he was in uniform, Staff Sergeant insignia 1 grade down from where he'd been. He stood in the doorway with his hands at his sides and his posture carrying the specific qualities she had first noticed in him on day 8 of the program, the quality that had been developing through the 2nd week and that she had documented in her assessment notes as trajectory significant. It was the quality of a person who was no longer spending their energy maintaining a position. There was more of him present than there had been when he walked into the Anchor on a Friday night 3 weeks before that. "Lieutenant Carter," he said, "do you have a few minutes?" She looked at him for a moment. "Come in." He sat in the chair across from her desk, the same chair Reyes had sat in. He held his hands together in his lap, not clasped tightly, just resting. "I'm being reassigned," he said. "Fort Liberty, 2 weeks." "Okay," she said. "I wanted to." He stopped, started differently. "I've been trying to figure out how to do this correctly. I've written it down several times. I've had the conversation with my CO. I've had it with my JAG. None of that is this." He paused. "I want to say something to you directly. Not through a document, not through a formal process. Person to person, if you're willing to hear it." Emily put her pen down. She looked at him. "Go ahead." Ryan looked at his hands for a moment, then back at her. "What I did at the Anchor was wrong," he said. "Completely wrong. Not in the legal sense that the tribunal documented, though it was that too. Wrong in the sense that I looked at you, a person who had done things I will never be clear to know about, who was sitting in a public place exercising her right to exist quietly, and I decided that her existence was something I had permission to comment on and then strike." His voice was steady. He was not performing this. "I decided that because something in me needed to, because her quiet was threatening to me, because I had built my entire professional identity on being the most significant person in a room, and she wasn't giving me that position, and I responded to that like someone who didn't know what strength actually was." The room was quiet. Emily held his gaze. "I've spent 6 weeks in the consequence of that," Ryan continued. "The demotion, the notation, the remediation program. All of it is real and all of it is right, and I'm not here to relitigate any of it. I'm here because the formal process does what it does, and what it doesn't do is give me the chance to say I see it. The whole thing, what I was, what I did, what it cost, I see it." He paused. "And I'm sorry, not the kind of sorry that asks you for something. The kind that's just true. That's the whole thing. It's just true." The room held the weight of that for several seconds. Emily looked at him. She thought about a parking lot and a decision tree and 19 pages before midnight. She thought about day 3 circle session, the first morning of the second week, his voice saying Friday night, and the quality of the silence that had followed. She thought about the 0200 shift in the junction call and 4 sentences in the mirror exercise that had said more than most people managed in 4 paragraphs. She thought about what she had said to Admiral Chen, anger as information, not instruction. She thought about what she had said to her sister. The weight of it is the right kind. "I hear you," she said. He nodded. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm not going to tell you it's fine because it isn't fine, and you know that better than anyone right now. And I'm not going to tell you it doesn't matter because it does and it did, and you carrying that is appropriate." She paused. "But I want to tell you something that I believe is true. What I watched happen to you in that program, the shift from day 1 to day 14, that was real. That wasn't performance. I've seen performance, and I know the difference. What you became in that building over 2 weeks is a better version of what you were always capable of." She paused again. "That matters. Not because it undoes Friday night, it doesn't, but because you're going to Fort Liberty, and there are going to be Rangers there who are watching you the way your Rangers watched you at the Anchor, and what you show them about how to be, that's real. That's ongoing. That's the thing that outlasts any specific moment." Ryan Mitchell sat across from Emily Carter and heard those words land one at a time in the specific silence of a person who is receiving something they didn't know they needed until they heard it. His jaw was set. His hands were still in his lap. His eyes were clear. "Thank you," he said. Same 2 words, different weight than she used them. Heavier, more personal. The weight of a man who had received something real and knew it. He stood. He straightened his jacket. He looked at her one more time. "Real warriors aren't remembered because they can throw the hardest punch," he said quietly. "They're remembered because they know exactly when not to." Emily looked at him. "Is that yours, or did you read it somewhere?" The corner of his mouth moved, just slightly. "I've been thinking about it for 6 weeks, he said. "I figure by now it's mine enough." He walked out. Emily sat at her desk in the quiet that followed him. And she sat with the complete whole finished feeling of something that had been in motion for 6 weeks finally coming to rest in exactly the place it was meant to land. 4 months later, February, the Joint Leadership Symposium. The room held 230 senior military personnel from 7 branches in 4 allied nations. The symposium had been running for 4 days. Emily's session was the last of the program, which was either the best or worst position, depending on whether the audience was still paying attention, and as she walked to the front of the room, she made a quick assessment of the 230 faces and determined that they were paying attention. Some of them more than others. Some of them for reasons she would only understand later. She stood at the front of the room without notes. She had given presentations before. She had spoken in professional contexts that required authority and precision, and the ability to make a room understand something it hadn't understood when she walked in. She was good at it. She didn't enjoy it the way some people enjoyed it, the people who liked the room's attention on them. She enjoyed the moment when the room understood something. That was the payoff. That was the thing worth standing up for. She talked for 40 minutes. She talked about cascade decisions and what happens when the choices you make compound without revision. She talked about mirror exercises and what you find when you read the same event from 2 perspectives. She talked about what performance costs when it's running alongside actual execution, the energy that goes into maintaining the image of competence that could be going into competence itself. She talked about what happens when people are given permission to be honest about failure in a professional context and what that permission does to subsequent performance levels. And then she talked about something she hadn't planned to talk about until she was standing there looking at 230 faces and understood that the room was ready for it. She talked about Friday night. Not all of it, not the personal details, but the structure of it, a person in authority using that authority to attempt to diminish someone whose existence felt like a challenge. The decision she made in a parking lot, the decision to be patient, the decision to trust the process more than her own need for immediate resolution. What that decision produced, what it cost in the short term, and what it returned over 6 weeks. She talked about what restraint actually is. Not passivity, not the absence of response. The most precise possible response to a situation, the one that produces the most durable outcome rather than the most immediate satisfaction. She talked about Reyes. She didn't use her name, but she described her a junior operator who had decided in advance to make herself smaller in every room she entered, and what had happened when she was in a room where someone saw her actual size and responded to that instead of the compressed version. What that produced, how that moved forward. How one person's decision to operate with full integrity in a situation that could have justified operating with much less had given a 22-year-old the architecture for a different kind of career. She finished. The room was quiet for 2 seconds. Then it wasn't quiet anymore. Emily stood at the front of the room and received the response of 230 people who had heard something they recognized as true, and she thought about what Admiral Chen had said, keep running the course, and she thought about the woman on K2 on the descent, staying focused because the summit being behind you was the most dangerous moment. She stayed focused. After the session, a line formed. It always did. People who wanted to say something specifically, who had heard a particular piece and needed to confirm it with the person who said it. Emily worked through the line with the same attention. She gave everything fully present for each person listening to what they were actually saying rather than what she expected them to say. Near the end of the line, a young woman in Army uniform, 24, maybe 25, medic insignia, the kind of person whose face hasn't learned yet to manage all of what's happening inside it, which meant Emily could read everything she was feeling very clearly. I'm Sarah Bennett, she said. Fort Liberty. Emily looked at her. Fort Liberty. Ryan's new assignment. Okay, Emily said. I heard what you talked about today, Sarah said. The person in the parking lot, making the decision to be patient. She paused. Her voice was working. I've been at Fort Liberty for 4 months. There's a staff sergeant there, Mitchell. He came in 6 weeks ago, and he's different from the other senior guys. He talks to junior soldiers like what they say matters. Like their assessment of a situation is actually worth integrating. She paused. Last week, he stopped something that was happening to one of the other female medics. Not loudly, not dramatically. He just stopped it. And then he made sure she knew how to report it. He walked her through the whole process. Emily was very still. I don't know his full story, Sarah said, but I know that whoever he is now at Fort Liberty is someone I want to be in proximity to professionally, because he shows what it looks like when someone is operating from the right thing. She paused. I wanted to tell you that because I think maybe you had something to do with it. Emily looked at Sarah Bennett for a long moment. She thought about what she had said to Ryan 6 weeks ago in her office. You're going to Fort Liberty and there are going to be Rangers there who are watching you. She thought about what he had said back. Real warriors are remembered because they know exactly when not to. She thought about Reyes and the pool record in 19 pages before midnight in a Friday night in October when a man had raised his hand, and the most powerful thing a woman had ever done in that room was to walk away and sit in a parking lot and make a decision tree. She thought about legacy, what it actually was. Not monuments, not records, not even the report sitting in Admiral Chen's office that was going to change the training standards at 7 installations. People, moving forward, changed, changing others. The thing that starts in one place and arrives months later in a room you weren't in, through a person you have never met because someone you affected someone who affected them. Tell me about the advanced operator assessment, Emily said to Sarah. Are you thinking about it? Sarah blinked. Yes, maybe. I don't know if I'm... You're here, Emily said. You flew to a symposium on a February morning because you heard a session that mattered to you, and you waited in a line to say something true to a stranger. That's exactly the profile. She paused. I'll be running the next assessment prep program in April. If you want a spot, contact my office before the end of the month. Sarah looked at her. The expression on her face was the complete unmanaged version of what it looks like when a door opens that you weren't sure existed. Yes, Sarah said. Ma'am, yes. Emily nodded. April, she said. Don't be late. She moved to the next person in line. She worked through the rest of the line, and then she collected her materials from the podium, and she walked out of the symposium into the February afternoon, and she thought about April and Sarah Bennett and a staff sergeant at Fort Liberty who had walked a junior soldier through a reporting process, and she understood something about the nature of what she had done in that parking lot 6 months ago that she hadn't been able to fully articulate until this moment. She had not been protecting herself that night. She had known that. She had said it in various forms to various people since then. But what she understood, now standing in the February afternoon with 230 people behind her, and April ahead of her and Sarah Bennett somewhere in between, was the full shape of what she had been protecting. She had been protecting the possibility of this. All of it, every thread, Reyes deciding to be visible, Ryan stopping something at Fort Liberty, Sarah standing in a line in February to say something true, the recommendations package at 7 installations, the cascade scenario in the institutional training record, the mirror exercise that would run in every joint program from the first quarter forward. None of it happened if she threw a punch in the anchor. None of it happened if she spent 6 weeks on revenge instead of process. None of it happened if she let the anger be her instructions instead of her information. It all happened because she sat in a parking lot on a Friday night and made a decision that was in the moment the loneliest and most difficult decision of her professional life. And what it produced over 6 months was not just justice. It was the kind of change that doesn't stop. The kind that moves through people and keeps moving. The kind that arrives in rooms you'll never visit, through people you'll never meet because of a single, precise, disciplined choice to trust the slow thing over the fast one. Emily Carter walked to her car in the February afternoon. She thought about April. She thought about what she was going to build next. She started driving. The course was still in front of her, and she was still running it because that was what she did. That was who she was. That was and always would be